The badge they handed me at my granddaughter's wedding did not have my name on it. It had a table number and a meal code. I read it twice standing at that check-in desk, and then I understood exactly what it meant, because I had spent 30 years reading documents that other people only skimmed. My name is Ramona Vance. I am 72 years old, and for 30 years I worked as a title examiner and escrow officer for a title insurance company in Rockland, Maine. My job was to trace ownership. I read deeds, mortgages, liens, and probate files. I built chains of title going back 100 years, and I found the broken links in them. It is quiet work, and most people think it is dull, and I let them think so because they are wrong in a way that took me half my life to understand. Every property in this country has a story written into the public record, and almost nobody ever reads it. A house is not just a house. It is a stack of paper going back to the day the land was first cut out of somebody's farm, and every sorrow and every betrayal and every act of love that family ever committed is in that stack somewhere, if you know how to look. I knew how to look. I could tell you which families were exactly what they appeared to be, and which ones were held together with paper and hope. I retired in 2016, and I never once imagined that the last chain of title I would ever build would be my own, or that I would build it sitting alone in a one-room apartment with a magnifying glass and a pad of grid paper while my hands shook, not from age but from the particular kind of anger that has nowhere to go. I want to tell this in order, because order is the only thing I have ever fully trusted. People lie. Faces lie. My own son could sit across a table from me and lie with his hand on my knee. But a date is a date, and a signature is a signature, and a page recorded in a public building on a Thursday morning is a fact that will still be true after everyone who lied about it is dead. So I am going to give you the dates carefully, because by the time this is over, the dates are the whole story. That morning I got up at 5:30. I had laid the dress out the night before the way my mother used to lay out clothes for church, smoothing it flat with the side of her hand as if the fabric could be reasoned with. It was pale blue, a silk blend, and I had bought it on Main Street in February, on a payment plan 12 months at $41 a month. I remember the girl at the register asking who it was for, and I told her it was for my granddaughter's wedding, and she smiled the way young people smile at old women in nice dresses, kindly and without really seeing them, and she said it would be worth every penny. I have thought about that since. Worth every penny. I was still paying for it the night I wore it, and I will be paying for it for several more months. And I have decided I am going to keep paying it off to the end rather than let it go, because I earned that dress, and I am not ashamed of a single one of those $41 payments. It took me almost an hour just to fasten it. There were 11 covered buttons up the back, small ones, the kind that look delicate, and instead are a small daily cruelty to a woman with hands like mine. Rheumatoid arthritis. The joints in my fingers are thick, now swollen at the knuckle, and some of the fingers have started to drift sideways at the tip, the way old fence posts lean when the frost has worked at them enough winters. I did those 11 buttons one at a time in front of the mirror, using a steel crochet hook to hold each little loop open while I pushed the button through. It is a trick I worked out years ago. You learn 100 small tricks like that when your hands begin to fail you, and you do not tell anyone, because the tricks are the difference between managing on your own and having to ask, and asking is the beginning of the end of a certain kind of freedom. When I finished, I sat on the edge of the tub and rested 10 minutes, waiting for the ache to settle back down. I do not drive anymore. I gave it up in 2019 after my cardiologist changed one of my heart medications, and I had a spell of lightheadedness out on Route 1 with a log truck on my bumper, and I decided that morning that I would rather lose the car than lose my nerve behind the wheel and take somebody with me. I sold the car to a young man who was starting a lawn service and needed something to pull a trailer, and I did not replace it. And I have gotten around on the coach and on my own 2 feet ever since. So that morning, dressed and rested and buttoned, I put on a little coral lipstick I have owned so long the color is worn down almost to the metal, and I settled my silver hair into a low bun, and I walked the 4 blocks to the bus stop with my purse over my arm, and I took the 10 o'clock coach down to Portland. 80 miles. 2.5 hours along the coast past all the little towns I have known my whole life, the white churches and the boatyards and the flat gray harbors with the lobster boats swinging on their moorings. I sat by the window and I let myself remember, which I do not often allow, because memory at my age is a room you can get lost in. I thought about the first time I ever held Delaney Vance in a hospital room in Rockport in the summer of 2000. 6 pounds and 11 ounces. Her father cried, my son cried, standing there in the doorway with his hand over his mouth, and I remember thinking, whatever else goes wrong in this family, Whatever mistakes we have made and are going to make, we have gotten this part right. This child is going to be loved. I believed that completely. I held her for the first hour of her life while her mother slept, and I walked her back and forth in front of the window with the summer light coming in, and I told her all the things you tell a newborn who cannot understand you, the promises you make to a person who will never hold you to them. I kept most of those promises. I want that on the record, too. The bus put me into Portland at 12:30, and the ceremony was not until 3, and I had no way to arrive later, so I walked to the hotel and sat in the lobby for 2 hours with my purse on my knees. It is a small thing. I want you to hold on to it anyway. A woman of 72 sat alone in a hotel lobby for 2 hours in a good dress to be on time for a wedding that had already, without my knowing it, decided exactly what I was. I watched the guests arrive, the good coats and the wrapped gifts, and I felt the ordinary flutter of anticipation you feel before a family occasion, that foolish, hopeful thing that will not die in a person, no matter how often it is disappointed. A young man from the front desk asked once if I was waiting for someone, and if he could bring me anything, and I said no thank you. He was the only person in that whole building who looked at me and saw a grandmother waiting for her family, and he was a stranger paid $9 an hour to be kind. At 2:45, I got up and I smoothed the front of my dress with both hands, that anxious small gesture women my age make, and I got in the line at the check-in desk. The coordinator was a woman named Wendy Osgood, late 30s, in a dark suit with a tablet in one hand and a thin headset around her neck. I want to be fair to her because it matters later, and because I have learned that most of the cruelty in this world is done by people who are not cruel. She was not cruel. She was efficient. She was working from a list somebody else had made, and she had 200 people to seat and a schedule to keep, and I was a line on her tablet the same as I was a line everywhere else that day. She asked for my name, and I gave it to her, and I could not keep a small pride out of my voice when I said it. Ramona Vance, I said. I am the grandmother of the bride. And she scrolled. Her thumb went down the screen once and then again, and her face did the small, polite thing a face does when it is looking for you and cannot find you, that professional flicker of concern that is not really concern at all. Just a moment, she said. And then she swiped over to a different screen, a different list, and there I was. Oh, she said, here we go. And there was something in the way she said it, a small satisfaction at a problem solved, that I did not understand until I was holding the reason for it in my hand. She reached into a plastic tray on the desk and pulled out a laminated badge on a black lanyard, the same kind the band had, the same kind the photographer wore, and she held it out to me across the counter. I took it. I looked at it. It said vendor and staff. Below that it said meal only, no bar service. Below that it said table 19. It did not say Ramona Vance. It did not say grandmother of the bride. It did not say anything about me at all. I turned it over, thinking there had been a mistake, thinking the back would have my name and the back was blank. There is a particular silence that happens inside you when something you have half known for years finally arrives in a form you cannot argue with. It is the opposite of loud. It is the sound of a great many small doubts, each of which you had talked yourself out of, all falling still at once, because now there is no need to doubt anything. I stood there holding that badge and felt that silence come down over me like the lid coming down on a box. She handed me a folded sheet of paper along with the badge. I want to be precise about this because it is the hinge. The whole first part of this story turns on. She did not hand me that sheet to hurt me. She handed it to me because I was entitled to it. I was on the staff list, and everyone on the staff list receives the staff meal instruction sheet, and she was a thorough woman doing a thorough job. Nobody made a mistake. Nobody was careless. Nobody dropped a clipboard where I happened to be standing. The system worked exactly the way it had been built to work, and the system had looked at me and decided where I belonged, and it had put me there without a flicker of doubt. There is a problem with this badge, I said, and even as I said it, I could hear how small my voice had gotten, how it had lost the pride it had a moment before. She was already looking past me at the couple next in line. The service entrance is through the corridor on the left if you need it, she said, not unkindly, not even really to me, and then doors open in 10 minutes and her eyes had already moved on. I stepped out of the line. I did not make a scene. I have never in my life made a scene, and I was not going to start in a hotel lobby in a dress I could not afford in front of 200 people who were about to watch my granddaughter get married. I moved off to the side near a great white floral arrangement, and I put on my reading glasses and I unfolded the sheet of paper she had given me, because I am a woman who reads what is put in front of her. That is the whole trouble with me, my family would tell you. I read what is put in front of me. It was a catering worksheet. I knew the format the instant I saw it, the way you know a face in a crowd before you know the name that goes with it, because I had reviewed 10,000 pages of billing detail in my working life, and they all have the same bones, line items, counts, a subtotal. At the top of this one were the 2 meal counts laid out plainly the way a caterer lays them out, so the client can see where the money goes. Guest plate, $185 per head. Staff plate, $42 per head. And below that, under a small heading that read Reclassifications, there were 4 names. Tarbox Verna, Ames Marjorie, Hutchins Pauline, Vance Ramona. Verna Tarbox is my late husband Gordon's aunt. She is 81 years old, and she has been part of this family since before my son was born. Since before I married into it, a small, fierce woman who taught me how to put up green beans the first summer Gordon brought me home. Marjorie Ames and Pauline Hutchins are cousins on Gordon's side. 74 and 71 women I have sat beside at every funeral and every christening for 40 years. The 4 oldest people invited to that wedding. Someone had gone down the guest list and found the 4 of us and moved us quietly off the guest count and onto the staff count, where a plate costs $42 instead of $185. I did the arithmetic. I did not have to try. 30 years of doing it in my head made it happen before I could stop it. 185 minus 42 is 143. 143 times 4 is 572. $572. That was the number. That was what we 4 were worth moved from one column to another. That was the savings. And here is the thing I have never been able to make anyone understand who has not done my kind of work. What I felt standing there was not heartbreak. Not first. The heartbreak came later in the dark on the bus. What I felt first was the flat, clean, professional click of a document making sense. Because a person can say anything to your face. A person can tell you they were just busy, that the missed calls were nothing, that of course you are family, of course you belong. But paper cannot lie about what a person was thinking when they wrote it. Paper records the decision. Somebody in my family had sat down at a computer on some ordinary evening with a spreadsheet open, and they had looked at a list of the people who loved this bride most in the world, and they had asked themselves a single question. Which of these can we move to the cheap column without anybody making a fuss? And they had answered it. They had picked the 4 oldest. They had picked the 4 least likely to complain, the 4 least likely to matter, the 4 whose feelings could be spent to save $572 against a wedding that, as I would later learn, was drowning in borrowed money. And one of the 4 was me. I folded the sheet in half carefully along its own crease, and I put it in my purse. I did not crumple it. A document you may need later is not something you crumple. Then I lifted the black lanyard over my head over my careful silver bun, and I let the badge settle against the pale blue silk of the dress I was still paying off at $41 a month. I want to be honest with you about why I put it on, because there is a version of this where I put it on out of some grand dignity, and that is not the truth. The truth is smaller and sadder. I put it on because I had come 80 miles on a bus, and I was 72 years old, and I was not going to turn around and go home without seeing my only granddaughter get married. That is the whole reason. Sometimes the reason a person endures a thing is exactly that simple and exactly that sad, and I have stopped pretending otherwise. Table 19 was in the back left corner of the ballroom, 6 feet from the service doors where the waitstaff came and went with their trays. Every time those doors swung open, you got a wave of heat off the galley behind them, the smell of steam and scorched coffee, the clatter of a working galley. Verna Tarbox was already at the table when I got there. Her folding walker leaned against her chair, and Marjorie and Pauline were across from her, and there were 2 young men from the sound company in polo shirts, and 2 limousine drivers in black suits, one of whom never took off his sunglasses the entire evening. Verna has cataracts, and she leans in close when she talks, and she looked up at me as I came around the table, and she said, "Ramona, are they doing the seating different this year?" And I looked at that old woman who had taught me to put up beans wearing the same plastic badge I was wearing, and I said, "Yes, Verna, they are." And I sat down next to her, and I put my hand over her hand on the white tablecloth, and I held it there because it was the only useful thing I could do. I need to tell you why I was a poor woman sitting in that corner, because if you do not understand it, you will not understand anything that comes after. I was not poor by accident. I was poor on purpose, and the purpose was my son. In March of 2018, my husband Gordon died. His heart. He was 66 years old, and we had been married 44 years, and he went out to the truck one cold morning to fetch the reading glasses he had left on the seat, and he did not come back in. I found him. He was sitting in the driver's seat with the door standing open and his hand still resting on the frame, as if he had meant to pull himself up and simply run out of the strength to do it. And the cold air was pouring into the cab, and for a moment, a terrible moment I have never told anyone about, I was annoyed with him for leaving the door open and letting the cold in. That is what 44 years does to you. Your first thought at the worst moment of your life is a small domestic irritation, because a marriage is 10,000 small domestic irritations, and the love is buried so deep inside them that you cannot feel where one ends and the other begins. 5 months later, in August of 2018, I sold our house in Rockland, a 9-room house on a corner lot with a lilac hedge Gordon had planted in the spring of 1981, a hedge that had grown from 12 bare sticks into a wall of purple every May for 37 years. I sold it for $290,000, and I gave every single dollar of it to my son. Curtis was 41 then. He came to me, and he said that Delaney had gotten into an art school, a good one, a real one, and that the tuition was more than he and Lorraine could carry, and that a fine arts degree from a program like that could change the whole shape of a young person's life. He said it was an investment. He used that exact word, investment. He said it sitting in my living room 3 days after the last of Gordon's mail had finally stopped coming, with his hand resting on my knee. And I looked at my son, my only child, the boy I had raised, and I said yes before he had even finished asking. I would have said yes to anything that year. I would have said yes to almost anything, to feel that I was still of use to somebody, that I still had a place in the machinery of this family, that being Gordon's widow did not mean being nobody at all. So I sold the house with the lilac hedge, and I moved into a 1-room apartment on Park Street, with a radiator that bangs all winter like a man trying to get out of a coffin, and a window that looks directly at the back wall of a laundromat, and I told myself it was fine. Cozy, I said when anyone asked. I told myself it was cozy because Delaney was going to art school, and I had made that possible, and that was worth a small dark room and the noise of other people's laundry. There was one thing I did not sell: 6 acres of shorefront at Spruce Head in the town of South Thomaston. My father bought that land in 1958. He was a lobster man, and he saved for 11 years to buy it, 11 years of setting aside what he could out of what the ocean gave him, and when he finally had it, he built the house on it himself over 4 summers with his brother Alvin, cutting and fitting every board. He shingled it in white cedar, and he set the granite doorstep with a come-along and a plank because he would not pay another man to do a thing he could do himself. When my parents died in 1996, 4 months apart, that land came to me through probate, their only child, and it has been in my name alone every single day from that day to this. I could not afford to keep it, and I could not bring myself to sell it, so I did neither. I let it sit. The taxes on shorefront in Knox County are not small, and my income is Social Security and a modest pension from the title company, so I applied for and received a hardship abatement from the town, which reduces the tax for people who genuinely cannot pay. Now listen to how the care crept in, because at the time each piece of it looked like love. Curtis filled out that abatement application for me, in his own handwriting. He said I should not have to sit on hold with the town office at my age, and I was grateful. He had himself added to my checking account as a joint signatory in 2018 because he said somebody needed to be able to pay my bills if anything happened to me, and that made sense to a woman who had just watched her husband die with his hand on a truck door. The homeowner's insurance policy on the Spruce Head house was set to send all its correspondence, not to my apartment on Park Street, but to his real estate office on Union Street in Rockland, because he said the mail at my building was unreliable, and he did not want a lapse in coverage on the one valuable thing I still owned. And after I stopped driving in 2019, he drove me to my cardiology appointments in Rockport every 3 months, and sat in the waiting room with a magazine while they listened to my heart. He did that for about 2 years. Then he got busy. Then it was Lorraine once. Then it was nobody, and I started taking the bus to my own heart appointments, and I told myself he had a business to run. I told myself all of it was my son taking care of his mother, and every single piece of it, every one of those 4 kindnesses created a document, a signature card, an application in his handwriting, a policy with his address on it, a pattern of a man managing his aging mother's affairs. Every one of them was a piece of paper with his name on it, and my name underneath, and paper, as I have told you, does not lie about what a person was doing. It would take me until a courtroom the following autumn to understand that my son had been building something out of those documents patiently over years, the way a mason builds a wall, one small stone at a time, and that the wall he was building was going to be used to prove that I was a helpless old woman who could not manage her own affairs. He was assembling the evidence of my dependence out of his own care for me. There is a cruelty in that so refined that I still cannot fully hold it in my mind. He was not only taking, I was arranging things so that the taking would look on paper like kindness that had simply come to its natural end. But I am getting ahead of myself, and I promise to keep this in order. That night I knew none of it. That night I only knew I was at table 19, 6 feet from the galley doors, wearing a badge that said vendor and staff, watching my granddaughter get married through a gap between a floral arrangement and a service door. The ceremony itself was fine. I could not see much from the corner, but I saw enough. Delaney came down the aisle on her father's arm, and she was beautiful, and I mean that plainly, not the way grandmothers say it, in a gown that must have cost more than I had spent on clothing in 10 years. Her face lit with the particular joy of a young woman on the day she has been promised her whole life will be the happiest. Preston Hale waited at the front, a good-looking young man with the easy confidence of someone who has never been told no. His father, Bernard, sat in the second row. Bernard Hale owns Hale Coastal Partners and builds on shorefront up and down this coast, and I had examined title on 2 of his projects before I retired, so I knew his name the way you know the name of a large fish that has been in your pond a long time. I did not think much of his being there. He was the groom's father. At the reception I ate my $42 plate. Chicken rice green beans. It was not bad, honestly. Verna could not cut her own chicken, her hands are worse than mine, so I cut it for her the way she once showed me how to snap beans, and we ate together in our corner and did not say much. And in 4 hours, not one person from the head table crossed the room to us. Not once. My son did not come. My daughter-in-law did not come. My granddaughter, whom I had held in the first hour of her life, whom I had taught to read and to paint, did not come. There were 200 people in that room, and the distance from my chair to the head table was 40 feet, and no one in my family walked those 40 feet, not one time in 4 hours. I counted. I am a woman who counts things. It is a professional habit and a personal affliction, and it has never once failed to tell me the truth. Then Curtis stood up with a microphone, and the room went quiet for him, the way rooms have always gone quiet for my son, because he has that in him, the thing that makes people wait to hear what a man is going to say. He has my husband's jaw, and he has my father's hands, big, square, capable hands, and it has never stopped being strange to me to see the hands of 2 dead men I loved attached to a living man I was beginning to understand I did not know at all. He thanked everyone for coming. He made a joke about Preston's golf handicap, and the room laughed. And then he said that he and Lorraine had one more thing to announce, and something in his voice made the room lean in. He said that some gifts you can wrap and some you cannot. He said that 4 generations of this family had summered on the same piece of shorefront at Spruce Head. He said it was the place his grandfather had built with his own 2 hands, which was true. That was my father dead these 30 years, who saved 11 years for that land. He said it was where he had learned to swim, which was also true. I taught him in that cold water myself, holding him under the belly while he kicked. He said it was where Delaney had taken her first steps, and that was true too. On the granite step my father said I had a photograph of it somewhere. And then he said that the house and all 6 acres had been put into Delaney and Preston's names as a wedding gift from the family. The room came up out of its chairs, 200 people standing and clapping. Delaney put both her hands over her mouth and began to cry. Bernard Hale rose to his feet and applauded with his hands up over his head, and somebody at the next table leaned to his neighbor and said, "That is $1 million view." And I sat at table 19, 6 feet from the service doors, wearing a plastic badge that said vendor and staff, and I listened to my son stand in front of 200 people and give away my father's land. Now I need you to understand what I did in that moment, because everything that came after grew out of it, and because it is the one thing in this whole story I am genuinely proud of. I did not stand up. I did not cry out. I did not walk to the front of that room and take the microphone out of my son's hand and tell 200 strangers that the land he had just given away had been in my name, and only my name, for 22 years, and that I had never signed a single thing conveying it to anyone. I wanted to. There is a version of me that did exactly that, and she lives somewhere just under my skin, and I have to live with her disappointment to this day. But I did not do it, and I did not do it because of the one thing 30 years in the title business teaches you above all others. When you find the broken link in a chain of title, you do not announce it. You do not call the seller in a fury, and you do not call the buyer to warn him, and you do not stand up in a crowded room and cry fraud. You get the certified copy first. You put your hands on the actual recorded document stamped and dated and impossible to alter before the other side knows you have seen anything, because the moment they know you are looking, the paper starts to move. Files go missing. Memories change. Documents that were sitting quietly in a drawer suddenly get shredded or corrected or lost. The record is the only ground that does not shift under you, and the only way to keep your footing is to get the record into your own two hands before you say a single word out loud. I had spent 30 years telling other people that. I had said it in gentler words to widows and to heirs and to frightened young couples across a counter. I had never once had to say it to myself. And so I sat in my corner in my badge, and I did the hardest thing I have ever done, which was nothing. I applauded with everybody else. My hands hurt the swollen knuckles grinding, and I clapped anyway, because a woman not clapping in a room full of people clapping is a woman who has been seen, and I did not want to be seen. Not yet. Being invisible had cost me everything I had. Now I was going to make it pay me back. When the dancing started and the attention of the room turned to the young couple on the floor, I opened my purse under the table and checked that the catering worksheet was still folded inside it. It was. Then I lifted the badge off over my head and I put that in the purse too next to the worksheet. Not because I was ashamed of it. Because it was evidence, and evidence goes in the file. That is a sentence I have said to myself so many times in my life that it has worn a groove. And I said it to myself then in the dark corner of that ballroom, and it steadied me. Evidence goes in the file. There is a whole philosophy of survival in those 4 words, and I did not fully know it until that night. I told Verna I had a bus to catch. She held my hand in both of hers, her cataract eyes searching my face for something she could feel but not see, and she said, "Ramona, sit down and let somebody drive you home. It is too late for you to be on a bus alone." And nobody was going to drive me. We both knew that. There was not one person in that room of 200 who was going to leave the party to drive an old woman 80 miles up the coast, and Verna knew it, and I knew it, and neither of us said so, because some truths you hold between 2 people without ever letting them into the air. She squeezed my hand and she let it go. I walked out through the lobby past a long table piled high with wrapped gifts in silver and gold paper. My envelope was in that pile somewhere. It had a check in it for $400, which had taken me 7 months to set aside $40 and $50 at a time out of the little that is left over after the rent and the medication and the $41 a month for the dress. Nobody saw me leave. I have made my peace with that, and it did not take me as long as you might think, because I understood walking out through that beautiful, indifferent lobby, a small, hard truth that has served me ever since. A person who is not on the guest list cannot be missing from it. You cannot lose what you were never counted as having. They could not notice I was gone because as far as the machinery of that evening was concerned, I had never fully been there. I was staff. Staff leaves. Nobody marks it. The northbound coach was almost empty, and it smelled of diesel and old coffee, and the windows were black glass with my own faint reflection floating in them over the dark countryside. 2 college students slept in the back. Somewhere around Brunswick, with the bus rocking under me and the heat vents ticking, I took out my old phone, the one with the crack across the corner of the screen, and I put on my reading glasses and I typed in a web address. I did not have to look up because I had typed it 10 times a day for the last 12 years of my working life. The Knox County Registry of Deeds online search. I entered the grantor name, Vance Ramona. I entered the town, South Thomaston. And then I sat there for a moment with my thumb over the button, and I thought about all the times I had done this exact thing for strangers. Widows who did not know what their husbands had signed. Heirs who did not know what their parents had owed. Young men buying their first house who did not know there was a lien sitting on it like a spider in a corner. About a dozen times in 30 years I had found something on a search that made me have to tell someone gently across a counter a thing that changed their life, and I had watched their faces do the thing a face does when the paper turns out to be true. I never thought I would be on the other side of that counter. And then I pressed the button. 4 entries came up in the plain gray table the way they always do. Date type book page. I knew 3 of them by heart. My father's purchase in 1958. My parents' deeds through probate in 1996. A mortgage from 1974 taken out to reshingle the roof and drive a new well discharged in 1979. 3 entries, a whole family's worth of ordinary, careful history exactly as it should be. And then a 4th one I had never seen in my life. Quitclaim deed. Grantor Vance Ramona, Grantee Vance Coastal Holdings, LLC. Recorded March 20, 2025. Book 4471, page 202. I sat very still. The bus went over the bridge at Bath and the water under it was black. 16 months. That deed had been sitting in the public record for 16 months in a building I had walked into on almost every working day of my adult life, where the clerks knew me by my first name, and I knew theirs, and I had never known it was there because I had no reason to look at my own land. A grantor is the person who signs a deed. A grantor is the person who gives the land away. The record said that I, Ramona Vance, had given away my father's 6 acres to a company owned by my son 16 months ago, and I had never signed a single thing. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the armchair by my window, still in the pale blue dress with the phone glowing on the arm of the chair, and every 30 seconds the screen would go dark to save its battery, and I would wake it up again and read the same 4 lines as if reading them 100th time would make the 4th one dissolve. It did not. And at around 2 in the morning in that armchair in the dark, with the laundromat's blank wall out the window, I noticed the second thing. The thing that told me this was not a mistake or a confusion, but a plan. There were 4 entries on that parcel. That was all. There was no deed to Delaney and Preston Hale. There was no deed to anybody named Hale at all. My son had stood up in front of 200 people a few hours before and told them with tears in his voice that he had put my father's land into his daughter's name as a wedding gift, and there was not one line anywhere in the public record to support it. The gift did not exist. The gift was a story told out loud in a room to people who would never in their lives think to check. The land had not gone to Delaney. The land had gone to Vance Coastal Holdings, LLC, which was my son, and the beautiful, tearful moment at the wedding, the standing ovation, the $1 million view, all of it was theater. It was cover. It was a story planted in the minds of 200 witnesses, so that when the land eventually surfaced in someone else's name, every person in Knox County would already have a warm and ready explanation for how it had happened. A generous family gave their land to their girl. That was the story. And I was the only person alive who knew it was a lie, sitting alone in an armchair at 2 in the morning, in a dress I could not afford, beginning very quietly to understand exactly what my son had done. I put the phone down. I did not cry. That surprised me, and it went on surprising me for days, the dry-eyed steadiness of it. I think now that I did not cry because crying is what you do when a thing is finished, and this thing was not finished. This thing I understood sitting there as the sky began to go from black to the first hard gray of a coastal dawn was only just beginning, and I was going to be the one to begin it. The Knox County Registry of Deeds is on Union Street in Rockland, in the same brick county building where I had my back office for the last 12 years of my career. I have walked up those granite steps in every weather this coast can produce. I walked up them in the ice storm of 1998 when the whole town was dark and the courthouse ran on a generator. I walked up them the morning after both my parents died 4 months apart to begin the probate, because there is always paperwork, and the paperwork does not care what happened to you the night before. And I walked up them the morning after Gordon died to start the survivor filings in the same numb days, because that is the truth about death that nobody tells you at the funeral. Someone still has to go to the registry. Someone always has to go to the registry. I was that someone in my family for 40 years. I did not understand climbing those steps that Monday morning that this time I was going for myself. I was there at 8 o'clock when the doors opened. The record room has not changed in the years since I left it. Long oak tables worn pale in the center where 1,000 hands have rested. Green shaded lamps that nobody has needed since they put in the overhead fluorescents, but nobody has had the heart to remove either. Rows of index volumes bound in maroon buckram with the years stamped in gold on the spines, receding back into the dim end of the room where the old grantor indexes live, the ones nobody digitizes because nobody has the money. And the whole place smells of dust and warm toner, a smell I have loved for 40 years and am not ashamed to say I have missed. I stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed it in, and something in me that had been rigid since the wedding loosened by a single notch, because I was in the one room in the world where I knew exactly what I was doing. Glenna Rourke was at the counter. She has worked in that office since 1988, which means we overlapped for 28 years, and there is not much about the shorefront of this county that Glenna does not carry in her head. She can tell you the book and page of half the waterfront parcels between Owl's Head and Cushing from memory, the way some women can tell you the birthdays of everyone in their church. She looked up when I came in, and her whole face opened. "Well," she said, "look who is up right before 9. And there was such simple gladness in it, an old colleague pleased to see an old colleague, that I nearly lost my composure right there, because it had been a long time since anyone had been simply uncomplicatedly glad to see me. "I need a certified copy," I said. "Book 4471, page 2. She wrote it on a slip. She did not ask me why. And I want to be very clear about this, because there is a version of this story going around inside my own head even now, in which a kind woman behind a desk took pity on a wronged old lady and rescued her, and that version is false, and I refuse to let it stand. Glenna Rourke did not rescue me. Glenna Rourke did her job. She took a book and page number, she pulled the record, she ran it through the certifying machine, and she charged me the fee, $4 a page, the same fee she would have charged anyone. That is the whole of what she did. And it is exactly what the office exists to do. She could not have helped me if I had not known what to ask for. The entire machinery of the public record is built for people who know what to ask for, and it is very nearly useless to people who do not. And that gap, that terrible gap between the people who can read the record and the people who cannot, is the gap my son fell into like a wolf. He was a licensed real estate broker who did not know how to read a chain of title, and I was a retired file clerk who did. That was the whole contest in the end. That was the entire fight reduced to its bones. He had the money and the power and the family on his side, and I had the one thing he had never once thought to be afraid of, which was that his mother knew how to read. While Glenna was pulling the deed, I told her I would need the transfer tax declaration as well. She raised an eyebrow at that over the beaded cord of her glasses. "Somebody being difficult," she said, which is registry humor, and I said somebody is going to be, and she gave a short laugh and went to get it. I should explain what a transfer tax declaration is, because it turns out to matter enormously, and because almost nobody outside my trade has ever heard of it. In the state of Maine, you cannot record a deed without filing a declaration alongside it that states the consideration, which is the legal word for what was actually paid. If the transfer is a genuine sale, you write in the price. If it qualifies for one of the exemptions, a gift, a transfer to a wholly owned entity, a few others, you check the appropriate box and cite the exemption, and you write in a nominal figure, meaning essentially nothing. And here is the crucial part. That declaration goes into the public record, right beside the deed, in the same book, on the same day, available to anybody in the world who cares to ask for it. It is a small, ugly form, and it is one of the most honest documents in American life, because it forces a person to state in writing for the permanent record what a thing was really worth in the transaction. My son, the licensed broker, had filed one. Of course he had. He had to, or the deed would not have recorded. And I was betting walking up those steps that he had not thought for 1 second about what it would say to a person who knew how to read it. I paid my $8 for the 2 pages, and I signed the request log with my own name, my full name in my own hand. And I want you to hold on to that too, because from that moment forward, every single thing I did in this matter, I did in the open and daylight under my own name on the record. That was a decision, and I made it consciously standing at that counter. My son had worked in the dark with a page hidden inside a stack, with an address quietly changed, with a mailing quietly diverted. I was going to do the opposite of everything he had done. I was going to leave a trail so clean and so public that no one could ever say I had crept up on anybody. If I was going to take my land back, I was going to take it in the full light of the public record, the way it should be done. The way I had spent 30 years telling other people it should be done. There is a kind of revenge in that, in doing the honest thing so thoroughly that the dishonest thing beside it glows in the dark. I did not know it then, but that was the revenge I was choosing, and it was the only kind that would have satisfied me. I carried the 2 certified pages to a long oak table by the tall window, the same table I had sat at 10,000 times, and I put on my reading glasses and I read. The deed was 2 pages. The first page was standard quitclaim language, clean and competent. Ramona Vance of Rockland releases and quit claims to Vance Coastal Holdings, LLC, a Maine limited liability company, 6 acres more or less on the westerly side of the town road in South Thomaston, being the same premises conveyed to the grantor by the estates of her parents. And then the reference back to the 1996 book and page, the correct one, the exact one. Whoever had drafted that description had known precisely what they were doing. It was clean enough to pass a lender's review without a second glance. It was, I will admit, professional work, and there was a cold moment in which I wondered who had done it for him, because my son could not have written that description himself in 100 years, and the answer to that question would matter later. Then I turned to the second page, and the second page was the signature page, and there was almost nothing on it. 2 lines of closing language at the top. A ruled line for the grantor's signature. And below that, the notarial block, the little paragraph of certification, and the space for a seal. That was all. A nearly empty sheet. And on that ruled line in old faded blue ink was my signature. Not a copy of my signature, not a forgery of my signature. Ramona L. Vance, with the capital R made too tall, the way I have made it too tall since I was a girl, and the L in the middle looped closed in the particular way I have looped it since Sister Agnes stood over my desk in the 4th grade and made me write the whole page of it again because my first attempt was sloppy. Nobody else on this earth makes that letter the way I make it. I sat and I looked at my own hand, my own true and undeniable hand on a document I had never in my life seen before, and for a long moment I could not make it mean anything. It was like looking at a photograph of yourself in a place you have never been. And then I read the notarial block below the signature, the part of a deed I had been trained for 30 years to read before I read anything else, and which almost nobody outside this business ever reads at all. State of Maine, County of Knox. On this 14th day of March 2025, personally appeared the above named Ramona Vance, and acknowledged the foregoing instrument to be her free act and deed. And below that certification a signature, and below the signature a stamped circular seal with a commission number and an expiration date. And the name in that seal, the name of the notary public who had sworn over her own signature and her own commission that I had personally appeared before her and acknowledged this deed to be my free act and deed, was Delaney M. Vance. Delaney M. Vance, Notary Public, State of Maine, my granddaughter, the child I had held in the first hour of her life. The girl I had taught to read at my oak table, whose small hand I had guided across the page while she sounded out the word October. The 6-year-old who had painted me a purple horse with the first watercolor set I ever bought her and told me it was a picture of me. She had become a notary public, and she had taken her seal, and she had pressed it into a deed that swore I had stood in front of her and given away my father's land on a day when, as I would very shortly be able to prove beyond any argument, I had done no such thing and had not been within 20 miles of her. I put the page down flat on the oak table. Around me the record room went on with its small ordinary sounds. The furnace ticked. Somebody 2 tables over turned a page in an index volume with the soft dry sound of old paper. And I sat in the middle of all that ordinary quiet and looked at my granddaughter's name under a lie sworn to the state of Maine, and for the first time since the wedding, my eyes filled. They did not spill. I would not let them, not in a public building. But they filled, and I sat with them full, and I made myself keep looking, because I am a woman who reads what is put in front of her, and I was not going to look away from this. There is a thing I need to explain about what a notary actually does, because it is the thing my granddaughter destroyed, and it is small and precise and holy in its way. A notary does not certify that a document is true. A notary does not certify that a deal is fair or wise or freely made. A notary certifies exactly one thing and only one thing: that the person whose name is on the line stood in front of her, and she looked at that person, and it was that person, and that person signed. That is the entire job. It is a tiny hinge on which the whole enormous machine of American property turns. Because if you cannot trust that the person who signed a deed was really the person named in it, then you cannot trust any deed anywhere, and the entire structure of who owns what collapses into a fog. My granddaughter took that tiny holy hinge, the one thing she had sworn to the state she would protect, and she pressed her seal onto a page swearing a woman had stood before her who had not, because her father asked her to, and because it was easier than the alternative, and because she told herself a story about it that let her sleep. I will come to that story. She told it to me herself later at my own table. But that morning in the record room I did not yet know why. I only knew that she had done it, and that her seal made it provable, and that in trying to steal my land cleanly, they had handed me the one piece of evidence I could never have manufactured myself. I took the certified copies and I put them in my bag, and I walked back out past Glenna and told her thank you. And she said, "Any time, sweetheart, the way you say it," and I took the bus home to Park Street. And then I sat down at my small table and I went to work, and for the first time in 9 years, I felt entirely, completely, ferociously myself. I had a pad of 1/4-inch grid paper left over from the office. I have kept it for a decade because you do not throw away good grid paper, and because some part of me I think always knew I might need to build one more chain. I made myself a cup of tea and let it go cold at my elbow the way I always did when I was working, and I built the chain of title on my own land the way I had built 4,000 of them for strangers. You build a chain from the present backward link by link, each conveyance pointing to the one before it until you reach the root, the first deed that cut the parcel out of some larger whole. And if the chain is sound, every link connects cleanly to the next, and there are no gaps and no strangers. It is when it is right, one of the most beautiful things in the world, a chain of title. It is a family told in paper. It is proof that a thing was held and loved and passed down with care. 1958. Warranty deed. The fisheries co-op to Harold and Ruth Lunt, my mother and father, the root of the whole thing, my father's 11 years of saving made permanent in ink. 1974. A mortgage. Rockland Savings $4,000 for the roof, and the well discharged clean in 1979. My parents paying off their debt, the slow, honest way. 1996. 2 estate deeds 4 months apart, one for each parent as they died, both to me, Ramona L. Vance, their only child. And then on my grid paper, drawn in my own careful block capitals, 29 years of nothing. A long, clean, unbroken line down the page with no entries at all. And I want you to understand that in my trade, 29 years of nothing is not emptiness. It is the most beautiful thing a chain can show you. It means the land sat in one family and did nothing, borrowed nothing, sold nothing, betrayed nobody. A quiet stretch of years in a chain of title is proof of love. It is a family holding on. And then at the bottom of that beautiful quiet line, March of 2025, the link that did not belong. I drew it in and I sat back and I looked at the whole of it, 67 years of my family drawn down one page in my own hand and one link at the very bottom that was a lie. Now here is where 30 years matters, and here is where my son and my granddaughter made the mistake that undid them, though it would take a courtroom in the autumn to make it plain. I did not look at that signature and ask myself whether it was mine. I could see that it was mine. That question was closed. What I did instead was what a title examiner does, which is that I stopped looking at the signature and I looked at the page, the whole page, as an object, as a physical thing that had been made by a physical process. And the page was wrong. Page 1 and page 2 of that deed were not the same age. I held them up to the lamp, one in each hand edge, to edge the way you hold 2 swatches of fabric to see if they truly match. Page 1 had margins of 1 inch all the way around, which is what any current word processing template gives you by default. Page 2 had a left margin closer to 1 1/4 inch, and the body text sat higher on the sheet, the settings of an older template, a template from years before. On the certified scan page, 1 photographed clean bright white. Page 2 photographed with a faint warm yellow cast running down its right edge. A gradient the particular way paper goes when it has sat for years in a folder with light reaching one side of it and not the other. And the typeface of the 2 lines of closing language at the top of page 2 was a serif face, an old one, while page 1 was set in something newer and cleaner. 2 pages, 2 different templates, 2 different ages of paper, 1 deed. Somebody had written a new first page and stapled it to an old second page. Somebody had taken a signature page that already existed, a page with my true signature already on it, and a blank notarial block waiting at the bottom, and they had composed a fresh first page above it, the clean professional property description, and they had joined the 2, and they had recorded the result as a single deed. My signature was real. The page it sat on was real. But the deed was a Frankenstein, a body assembled from parts of 2 different corpses, and the seam ran right across the staple line, and I could see it, because I had spent 30 years learning to see exactly that. I sat back in my wooden chair, and the memory rose up in me like cold water coming up through the floor of a boat, and I knew before I had even finished remembering exactly where that signature page had come from, and exactly how long they had been waiting to use it. March of 2018, 3 days after we buried Gordon. Curtis came to the house at 10 in the morning with a folder under his arm. I was still wearing the black cardigan I had worn to the funeral because I had not gotten around to hanging it up, because I had not gotten around to anything. There were 7 casserole dishes in my refrigerator that belonged to 7 different women from the church, each one a small kindness I would have to remember to return, and I could not have told you at that moment what day of the week it was. I had slept perhaps 8 hours across the previous 5 nights. My son sat down beside me at the oak table, my father's oak table, the one Delaney would later sit at as a child, and he said, "Mom, I am going to take all of this off your hands." And I was so grateful I could have wept, because that is what a child is supposed to be able to do. That is the whole promise of having raised a son, that at the worst hour of your life he will sit down beside you and take the weight, and I had raised mine. And here he was, doing exactly that. And he did take the weight, at least the paper weight of it. He had everything organized, a competent, thick folder, copies of the death certificate for the various institutions that would demand them, the life insurance claim, the pension survivor election, which had a deadline I would otherwise have missed, the utilities that had to come out of Gordon's name and into mine, the electric and the phone and the oil company, the truck title, the bank. He would set a page in front of me and put his big square finger, my father's finger, at the bottom of it and say, "Right here." Mom and I would sign, and he would slide that page away into the folder and set down the next one. "Right here, right here, right here." I signed 21 times that morning. I know the number is 21, and I know it exactly because months later, when I was going through the copies, he had left me in one of those gray flat afternoons when a widow makes herself do the filing. I counted them, and there were 19. 19 copies. And I remembered 21 signings. I remembered the rhythm of it, the slide, and the set down 21 times. And I counted the copies again, and there were 19. And I told myself I had miscounted, that a grieving woman who has not slept is not a reliable witness to her own afternoon, that of course I had lost track who counts their own signatures. And I let it go. I put the folder away and I let it go, and I did not think about those 2 missing signings again for 7 years. I was not miscounting. I have never miscounted anything in my life. There were 21 signings and 19 copies, because 2 of the pages I signed that morning were never meant to become copies I would keep. And one of those 2 I understood now, sitting at my table with the certified deed in front of me, was a nearly blank sheet, a page with a signature line and a notarial block, and almost nothing else that my son had slid in front of me in the middle of that terrible morning and told me was the second page of the utility transfer. I even remembered asking. It is the one clear thing I remember from the whole blurred morning, because it was the one time I hesitated. I looked at the nearly empty page and I said, "What is this one?" And he said without a flicker, "It is the second page of the utility transfer. The first page is just the account numbers." And I signed it. My hand still worked well in 2018. The arthritis was there, but it was early, and my signature that day was full and strong and unbroken, the tall R and the closed loop, the signature of a woman of 64 and not of 71. And he took that page with my strong, true signature and its blank notarial block, and he did not throw it away, and he did not lose it. He kept it for 7 years. He kept a blank signed page of his grieving mother's for 7 years in a drawer or a file, somewhere the way a man keeps a thing he is not yet sure he will need, but cannot quite bring himself to destroy. And then in March of 2025, when he did need it, he took it out, and he wrote a new page above it, and his daughter sealed the bottom of it, and they recorded it, and gave my land away at a wedding. I want to say one thing carefully, because I have spent a great deal of time being angry at the woman I was that morning in 2018, and I have decided to stop, and I want it on the record why. I had buried my husband of 44 years 3 days earlier. I was 64 years old. I had barely slept in a week. My only child sat down beside me and told me he would take the weight, and I let him, and I signed where he pointed, because that is what a mother is supposed to be able to do with a son. That was not stupidity. I have called it stupidity to myself in the dark more times than I can count, and every time I have been wrong. It was not stupidity, it was trust. And trust and stupidity are not the same thing, no matter how much the outcome makes them look alike, and I will not let anyone tell me they are the same, and that includes me. The failure that morning was not mine. The failure was his, and he waited 7 years to complete it. And a man who waits 7 years to complete a betrayal cannot claim it was a moment of weakness. It was a plan. It was the most patient kind of theft there is. Now I am going to explain the one thing in this entire story that mattered more than anything else, the thing that I understood, and that no one else in my family understood, and that I still find bitterly funny in a way that is not funny at all. It is a distinction in the law, and it is small, and everything turned on it. If someone forges your signature on a deed, that deed is void. Not weak, not merely challengeable, void. It never existed, and it never conveyed anything, and it is as if it had never been written. And crucially, a person who buys land from a forger buys nothing, no matter how honest that buyer is, no matter how much money he paid, because you cannot receive what was never really given. A forged deed is a hole in the ground where a conveyance is supposed to be. But my signature was not forged. That was the trap they had built, whether they understood it or not. My signature was real, my true hand on a real page, which meant the argument could not be forgery. The argument had to be fraud, and the law in its long, strange wisdom splits fraud into two kinds, and the entire fate of my father's land hung on which of the two kinds this was. The first kind is called fraud in the inducement. That is when someone lies to you about the deal, but you know you are signing a deed. You know the paper is a deed. You know you are conveying your land, but you were tricked about the terms lied to, about the price or the reason or the promise attached. A deed obtained that way is voidable. You can undo it, but only against the person who cheated you, and here is the terrible catch. If that person has already sold the land onward to an innocent buyer, a buyer who paid fair value and knew nothing of the fraud, then the innocent buyer keeps your land, and all you are left with is the right to chase the man who cheated you for money he has very likely already spent. That is the lane in which people like me lose everything. That is the lane in which an old woman spends the last years of her life suing her own son for a debt he cannot pay while a stranger lives in her father's house. The second kind is called fraud in the factum, and it is a colder and stranger thing. Fraud in the factum is when someone lies to you, not about the terms of the deed, but about the very nature of the document itself. When they put a page in front of you and tell you it is one thing when it is another, so that you never knew, could never have known that you were signing a deed at all. In that case, the law says there was never a meeting of the minds. You did not agree to convey your land because you did not know you were being asked to. And a deed obtained by fraud in the factum is not merely voidable. It is void. Void from the beginning. It conveyed nothing. And a buyer who takes from a void deed, however innocent, however much he paid, takes nothing because there was nothing there to take. Utility transfer page 2. That was the whole case. That single sentence my son said to me across a table with casseroles in the refrigerator, 3 days after his father's funeral. He had told me the page was one thing when it was another. He had lied to me not about the terms of a deed, but about the very fact that it was a deed at all. I did not know I was signing a conveyance of my father's land, because he had told me I was signing the second page of a utility transfer, and I believed him because he was my son, and my husband was 3 days dead. That is fraud in the factum. That makes the deed void. And a void deed conveys nothing to anyone, not to Vance Coastal Holdings, and not therefore to anyone Vance Coastal Holdings might try to sell it to, no matter how much money changed hands. My son held a real estate broker's license. He had held it since he was 26 years old. He had passed the state examination. He did the continuing education courses every 2 years. He could talk to a client about comparable sales and closing costs and staging a front room. And he had never in 23 years of holding that license had the slightest reason to learn the difference between void and voidable, because in his world the closing happens and the check clears and the file goes into a drawer and nobody ever comes back. He did not know the difference. And his mother, the retired file clerk he had seated at table 19, had spent 30 years explaining that difference to 2 generations of loan officers and title agents and nervous young lawyers. And he had never once in all his careful planning thought to be afraid of what she knew. That is the part I still find funny. That is the joke at the center of the whole thing. He was so certain I was nothing that he built his entire theft on a foundation only I could see was rotten. I sat at my table until the tea was stone cold, and I wrote it all out on a legal pad in the plain language I would need for a lawyer, the void and the voidable, the 2 kinds of fraud, the seam in the paper, the 21 signings and the 19 copies. And then I capped my pen, and I sat back and I let myself feel for exactly 1 minute the thing I had not let myself feel since the wedding, which was not grief and was not even anger. It was something harder and cleaner than either. It was the feeling of a professional who has been handed a case she is going to win. I had built 4,000 chains of title in my life and helped a dozen frightened people take back what was theirs, and I had never once had the case be my own. Now it was my own, and I was very, very good at it. On Tuesday I called a lawyer. Her name is Harriet Doyle, and she practices elder law out of 2 rooms above a bakery in Camden, and she has a reputation in this county for taking cases she probably should not take, which is exactly the reputation I was looking for. I got her name from a woman I used to work with who said if you have got something that is going to make a family furious, Harriet is the one she does not scare, and she does not settle just to make a Tuesday easier. I did not go to her office to tell her a story. I have listened in my life to a great many people tell a lawyer a story sitting across a counter from them while they explained what had happened to them, and I have learned that a story does not survive a courtroom. A story is a thing made of feeling, and feeling is the first thing a good defense attorney takes away from you. What survives a courtroom is a document. So I did not bring Harriet Doyle a story. I brought her a folder 2 inches thick, and I laid it on her desk, and I let her read a certified copy of the deed and the transfer tax declaration, the declaration that stated a nominal consideration and claimed an exemption for a transfer to an entity wholly owned by the grantor. 6 acres of Maine waterfront moved for nothing into a company. I had the chain of title drawn on my grid paper, and then typed up clean every book and page cited the whole 67 years of it with the one bad link marked in red. I had the catering worksheet from the wedding with the 4 names under reclassifications. I had the badge itself, the laminated one still on its black cord, because a physical object in an evidence file has a weight that a description never will. And I had 4 bank signature cards laid out side by side in date order, 1991, 2018, 2022, and the current one from this spring. I want to tell you about the signature cards, because they were my own idea, and I am proud of them. And they turned out to matter more than almost anything else. My hands have been getting worse for 11 years. Rheumatoid arthritis does not arrive all at once. It comes on the way winter comes on a little more each season. And if you have a record of a person's handwriting across those seasons, you can watch the disease happen in the ink. So I had gone to my bank, and I had asked for copies of every signature card they had on file for me going back as far as they kept them. The 1991 card when my hand was young and firm. The 2018 card from the month my son had himself added to my account, the last year my signature was still strong. The 2022 card. And the current one from this spring when they reissued my debit card. Lay them out in a row, and you can see the decline like a hillside going down to the sea. The letters get smaller. The lines get shakier at the start of each stroke, where the swollen joint has to break loose before it will move. By 2022, the capital R has lost its height. And on the current card, I cannot make the closed loop in the middle initial at all without lifting the pen and starting the stroke again, because the joint simply will not carry the pen smoothly through the turn. And the signature on the deed recorded in March of 2025, had the full tall R and the whole unbroken loop. That is not the hand of a woman of 71 signing in the spring of 2025. That is the hand of a woman of 64 signing in the spring of 2018, 3 days after her husband's funeral with a son beside her, saying, "Right here, Mom." The disease itself was my witness. My own ruined hands laid out in ink across 3 decades testified that the signature on that deed could not possibly have been made on the day the notary swore it was made. I could not have signed that page in 2025 if you had held a gun on me. My hand had not been capable of it for years. Harriet Doyle read my folder without saying a single word for 18 minutes. I know it was 18 minutes because I watched the clock on her wall, and watching that clock while she read was one of the strangest quarter hours of my life, because I could see her face change as she went, could see her move from the ordinary courtesy she extends to a new client into something else, something sharper and more awake. When she finished, she took off her glasses and set them on the folder and looked at me and said, "Mrs. Vance, how long did you practice?" And I said I did not practice. I read title. And she said that is not an answer that is going to help me, because you have just handed me a cleaner pleading file than I have gotten from any attorney in this county in 6 years. And then she did the thing that told me I had chosen the right lawyer, which was that she told me the truth about my own case, instead of the comforting thing I wanted to hear. She said the deed argument was strong, the void versus voidable, the fraud and the factum, the 2 ages of paper. She said the statute was stronger still, and I will come to the statute. And then she said the hard part is going to be you. I asked her what she meant. She said there is a law in this state, written to protect dependent elderly people. It presumes that when an old person hands over something valuable to somebody they trust and does not get fair value back that they were pushed into it, and it puts the burden on the other side to prove they were not. It is a powerful law, and it is going to be the backbone of this case. But it was written for a certain kind of plaintiff. It was written for a frail, confused, dependent old woman. And you are going to sit in a witness chair in a superior court, and you are going to be by a wide margin the most competent person in that room, more competent than their lawyer, and more competent than me. And their attorney is going to look at you, and then he is going to look at the jury or at the judge, and he is going to say, does this woman look dependent to you? Does this woman look like anybody's victim? And Mrs. Vance, on the plain evidence of your own bearing, the honest answer is going to be no. I sat with that for a moment. It was I understood the exact center of the whole problem. The very competence that had let me catch them was going to be used to argue that I could not have been fooled. And then I reached into my bag and I put 3 more documents on her desk one at a time. The signature card with my son added as a joint signatory on my checking account in 2018. The hardship abatement application for the taxes on the Spruce Head land filled out and signed in my son's own handwriting on file with the town of South Thomaston. And the homeowner's insurance policy on that same house. The declaration page listing the mailing address for all correspondence not as my apartment, but as his office on Union Street. And I said I do not need to be weak. I have never been weak a day in my life, and I am not going to start performing weakness in a courtroom at 72 years old to satisfy a statute. I said I do not have to prove that I am dependent. I only have to prove that he had his hands on all of it. That for 8 years he controlled my money, filed my forms, received my mail, and drove me to my doctor. And he does not get to stand up and argue otherwise, because he wrote every bit of it down himself in his own hand over his own signature. He built the proof of a confidential relationship with his own 2 hands, thinking he was building the proof of his kindness. Let him try to unbuild it now. Harriet Doyle looked at those 3 documents for a long moment, and then she looked at me and she said, Mrs. Vance, I am going to need a retainer of $2,000, and I am going to tell you right now that I will take $400 of it and carry the rest because I want this one. And I paid her $400, which was the exact amount of the check I had left on the gift table at the wedding, though I did not tell her that. And I have thought since that there was a kind of justice in the coincidence $400 taken from the wedding and $400 spent to unmake it. I should tell you about the statute, because it is the second spine of this whole thing, and because it exists for exactly the reason my story exists. It is called in Maine the Improvident Transfers of Title Act, and the state legislature wrote it, because what happened to me happens in this state constantly over and over in every county to every kind of old person. It says in plain effect that when a person 60 years of age or older transfers something of major value and does not receive back something reasonably close to what it was worth, and the person on the receiving end was in a relationship of trust and confidence with them, then the law presumes the transfer was the product of undue influence. And here is the beautiful radical thing about it. It moves the burden. It does not make the old woman prove she was pushed. It makes the person who took the thing prove that she was not. It flips the entire weight of the courtroom onto the other side. In 30 years in this title business, I saw that statute save 4 families from exactly the kind of quiet inside theft that had happened to me, and I had thought each time what a fine and merciful law, and I had never once imagined it would one day be the thing that saved me. On the Thursday of that week, I went back to the registry for something unrelated, a copy of a different document, and Glenna said the thing that changed the clock and turned my careful, slow investigation into a race. She said that parcel of yours has been busy. An abstractor out of Portland ran the whole chain on it twice this month. Nice young woman. She asked me what my cutoff was for same-day recording because they are closing the last week of July. Closing, I said. And Glenna said that is what she said. I walked out onto Union Street and stood in the sun, and I felt the whole thing tighten around me because I understood at once what it meant. A lawsuit is slow, and a closing is fast. If that land transferred out of Vance Coastal Holdings to a buyer before I could get a claim onto the public record, then everything changed. Then I would spend the rest of my life not fighting my son, whose theft I could prove, but fighting some third party, some buyer who had paid real money and could stand up and say he knew nothing that he had bought in good faith, that whatever my son had done was not his fault. I have watched that fight ruin people. I have watched an old woman spend her last 4 years and her last dollars trying to pry her own house out of the hands of a stranger who genuinely did not know, and it is the worst kind of case there is, because there are 2 victims, and the law can only fully rescue one. But there is a thing you can do. There is a document you can record to stop exactly this, and I knew it the way I knew my own name because I had recorded 100 of them for other people. It is called a Notice of Pendency of Action, and it is a short, plain document that says to the entire world that a lawsuit is now pending in a court concerning this specific parcel of land. It does not decide anything. It does not freeze the land or seize it or prove a single fact. What it does is put every human being on earth on notice permanently in the public record so that no one who deals with that land afterward can ever stand up and say they did not know there was a fight over it. It ends the good faith buyer forever. You cannot be an innocent purchaser of a parcel that has a recorded notice of a lawsuit sitting right on top of it in the same registry. The notice makes innocence impossible, and you cannot record one until the lawsuit has actually been filed with the court and stamped. So the whole thing became a race between my complaint and their closing. Harriet Doyle filed the complaint in Knox County Superior Court on Wednesday the 29th of July. She worked most of 2 days straight to have it ready, and I sat in her cramped office above the bakery and helped her assemble the exhibits. And it was the first time in 9 years I had worked beside another competent person on a hard thing with a deadline. And I will tell you the truth, I enjoyed it. God forgive me, in the middle of the worst betrayal of my life, I enjoyed those 2 days. I was useful again. At 1:15 on the Thursday afternoon, the 30th of July, the day after the complaint was filed and stamped, I walked into the Knox County Registry of Deeds with the attested copy in a manila envelope, and I recorded the notice of pendency myself. I took a blank recording form off the stack at the counter, and I filled it out standing up, because I did not need to sit, and I did not need to ask anyone a single question. I have filled out that exact form more times than the young woman who was working the counter that day has been alive. I wrote in the book and page of the deed I was challenging. I wrote in the docket number of the lawsuit. And I wrote in the description of the premises, my father's premises copied word for word from his 1958 purchase, beginning at an iron pin set in the westerly side of the town road, the same words he had bought the land under, the same words that had sat unbroken in the chain for 67 years. I paid the recording fee out of my coin purse in coins and small bills, counting it out on the counter, poverty and power in the same small transaction. And Glenna, who was working the counter, read my form, and then she read it again, and then she looked up at me, and she did not say a single word, which I appreciated more than I can tell you, because there was nothing to say, and she was wise enough to know it. She stamped it in at 1:26 in the afternoon. And then I did the last thing, the thing that nobody outside my trade would ever have thought to do, and it is the only part of this entire affair that I would honestly call revenge. I had Harriet send a copy of the recorded notice that same afternoon by electronic mail and by overnight courier, both directly to the closing attorney and directly to the title insurance underwriter for the buyer. Because a buyer's own people can miss a filing. An abstractor can run a search on the wrong day. A closing can slip through a gap. But no title insurance company on this earth will issue a policy over a recorded notice of pendency once it has landed on their desk in writing, and no closing attorney will let his client wire money over a defect he has been personally provably notified of. I did not have to stop the closing. I did not have the power to stop the closing. What I had was the power to make it impossible for anyone to insure, and an uninsurable closing is a dead closing, because nobody in their right mind buys $1 million parcel of waterfront without a title insurance policy standing behind it. Friday morning I got up at 6 and made my tea and watered the geranium on the windowsill and did not think about it, which is a lie, but I did make the tea. And Harriet called me at 11:20. She said the buyer's abstractor had run the bring down search at 9:15 that morning, the last look at the record before the money moves the thing every careful buyer does on the morning of a closing. And there was a new line on that parcel that had not been there the day before. The notice of pendency stamped at 1:26 the previous afternoon, sitting on top of the deed like a hand laid flat on a table. The parties had sat down at 10 o'clock. It was over at 4 minutes past. I said thank you and I hung up the phone. And then my phone began to ring, and it did not stop. It rang at 11:26, and then again, and then again. Curtis, a number I did not recognize. Lorraine, Delaney, a Portland exchange. Curtis again. I stood at my window on a Park Street looking at the back wall of the laundromat, and I let it ring until the screen was nothing but a stacked column of the same few names, the whole apparatus of my family suddenly frantically trying to reach the old woman they had seated at table 19. And then I turned the phone off, and I put it face down in the drawer of my little table, and I went and finished my tea while it was still hot. It was the first cup of hot tea I had finished all the way to the bottom while it was still warm in 8 years. 8 years of tea going cold at my elbow while I waited for calls that did not come, while I got up to answer doors that were not being knocked on, while I lived in the permanent low readiness of a woman who is always about to be needed and never actually is. That was over now. Let them wait. Let the tea go cold on their end for a change. I drank mine to the bottom warm, looking at a brick wall, and I have rarely in my life tasted anything so good. Curtis came on Sunday. I had not seen my son inside my own home in 4 years, and he knocked the way a man knocks when he is used to doors opening for him twice hard with the flat of his hand. I opened it and I said, "Come in." And then before he could get his bearings, I walked to my little table and I sat down, and I put a yellow legal pad squarely in front of me and took the cap off a pen. He looked at the pad. "What is that?" he said. I said, "I am going to write down what you say while you say it, and when you leave, I am going to date it and sign it." I did that for 30 years. It is a habit. Sit down. I did not sit down. He stood in the middle of my one-room apartment, this large man in an expensive suit, and I watched his eyes travel across the water stain on the ceiling and the banging radiator and the window that looks at the back of the laundromat. And I watched him take in for the first time in 4 years the exact quality of the poverty he had put me in, and I watched a small flicker of distaste cross his face before he could stop it. And I understood something watching that flicker. He had never once been here. 4 years I had lived in this room, and my son had never once climbed the stairs to see it, because to see it would have been to know it, and he had arranged his whole life so as not to know it. And now he was standing in it, and it was worse than he had let himself imagine. And even now, even standing in the wreckage of what he had done to me, the thing that crossed his face was not shame for me, but distaste at the surroundings. Then he got to work on me, and I want to describe it precisely because it was a performance, and it was a good one, and it is important that you see how good it was. He went through 3 versions of himself in the space of 20 minutes, and I wrote each one down as it came. He picked love first. They always pick love first. "Mom," he said, and his voice caught just slightly in exactly the right place, the way a good actor catches his voice. "I know the wedding was hard on you. I know you felt left out. Nobody meant for that to happen. It was chaos. There were 200 people. Things fell through the cracks." And I wrote that down in his own words. Things fell through the cracks. 4 generations of my family and I had fallen through the cracks of a spreadsheet to save $572, and my son stood in my apartment and called it chaos. He watched my hand moving across the pad, and he saw that love was not landing, and he shifted smoothly into the second version, which was explanation. The whole business with the land, he said, was a family planning matter. The property had become a liability. The taxes were eating me alive, he said, which was almost funny, because he was the one who had filed the abatement that proved I could not pay them. The roof needed doing. The septic was failing. Putting the land into the LLC was simply the responsible way to hold it, so that it would pass cleanly when the time came, so that I would not have to worry about it, so that the family would not have to deal with a mess when I was gone. He had done it, he said, looking at me steadily for me. I wrote that down too. He did it for me. Then he asked in a reasonable voice, the voice you would use to ask a stranger to move his car, whether I would have my lawyer withdraw the notice from the record. I set down my pen, and I said, "Curtis, on the 14th of March last year, where was I?" He said, "Mom, I have no idea where you were on some random day over a year ago, and neither do you." And there it was. Neither do you. My son telling me to my face in my own home that I did not know where I had been, that my own days were a fog. I could not be trusted to remember laying the groundwork of the very argument his lawyer would try to make in a courtroom, that I was a confused old woman who signed things without knowing and could not account for her own time. He was rehearsing it on me. He was trying it out. I reached into the folder on the table, and I put a single sheet of paper in front of him. It was a certificate of jury service from the Knox County Superior Court in Rockland. My name, my juror number, March the 14th, 2025. Signed in at 8:40 in the morning. Signed out at 4:15 in the afternoon. Stamped by the clerk of courts. I had served on a jury pool that day 7 hours and 35 minutes of it in a courthouse under the supervision of the state of Maine, with my name on a roll and a number pinned to my chest in the exact building where this whole matter would eventually be decided. And at some point during those 7 hours and 35 minutes, according to the notarial certificate on the deed my son had recorded, I had personally appeared in front of his daughter 20 miles away and acknowledged the deed to be my free act indeed. I could not have. I was in a jury room. It was documented. It was stamped by the same court. He looked at the certificate. He did not pick it up. I have thought about that a great deal since that he did not pick it up, because a man who believes a document might be wrong picks it up to check, and a man who knows exactly what it says leaves it lying on the table like something hot. And I said, "And I will tell you one more thing, Curtis, because you are going to hear it in a courtroom anyway, and I would rather you heard it first from me." I was 71 years old that spring. In this state, a person over 70 can decline jury service simply by asking, and nobody questions it. Nobody asks a single thing. I could have stayed home. I did not decline. I got up at 6 in the morning, and I put on my good shoes, and I took the bus, and I served the whole day because it is my duty, and because I have never once shirked a duty in my life. So when your lawyer stands up in that courtroom and tells the judge that my memory is going, that I sign things without understanding them, that I am a confused old woman who has misplaced her own land, you make sure that he knows that on the exact day in question, I was sitting in a jury pool that I volunteered for, that I was entitled to skip, and that I lasted the entire day. You make sure he knows what kind of woman you are calling confused. And that is when the third version came out. The love was gone, and the explanation was gone, and what was left was the truth of him. He said, "You are going to destroy this family." I said, "Sit down, Curtis. You are making the room small." He said, "Do you understand what this does to Delaney? 3 weeks after her wedding. Do you understand that Bernard Hale is going to come after every one of us?" And I picked up my pen again, and I looked up at him, and I said, "Spell his name for me. Is it Bernard with a D?" He left. He did not slam the door. He closed it very carefully, very quietly, with a soft, deliberate click. And that frightened me far more than a slam would have, because a slam is temper and temper passes. And a man who closes a door that carefully is a man who has moved past temper into something colder and more patient. I sat at my table for a long time after he was gone, with my hands flat on the wood, pressing them down until they stopped shaking. And it took a while because I am 72, and my son had just stood in my home and threatened me and called me confused, and I had not let him see a single crack in me, and holding yourself that steady for that long costs something you have to pay back afterward alone in private with your hands flat on a table. And when the shaking finally stopped, I dated the pad and I signed it my full name, the tall R and the broken loop. The honest, crippled signature of the woman I actually am, at the bottom of the record of everything my son had just said. Evidence goes in the file. Delaney came on Wednesday. She came alone on the bus, which surprised me because I did not think any of them would lower themselves to a bus. And she stood in my doorway in a plain sweater with no makeup on, and she looked 12 years old. She looked standing there exactly like the child I had taught to read, and it went through me like a blade, because I had spent 3 days building myself into iron, and one look at her nearly melted the whole thing back down. I made her tea. She held the mug in both hands and did not drink any of it, and I recognized that the holding of a warm thing you cannot bring yourself to drink, because I have done it 1,000 times, waiting for calls that did not come. I had prepared myself for her to lie. I had rehearsed lying awake exactly what I would say when she told me her father had deceived her, when she told me she had thought I had already signed the deed at home, and was only completing a formality when she gave me some version of the story that let her be a victim too. I had my answers ready for all of it. She did not do any of it, and I will give her that for the rest of my life, however long that is. She sat at my table and she said, "Grandma, I knew you weren't there." I did not say anything. I had learned a long time ago at that same counter where I read title that when a person is about to tell you the truth, the kindest and most useful thing you can do is get out of the way of it. She said I sat at the desk in the office and Dad put the deed in front of me, and he said it was already signed, that you had signed it at home, and I knew what that meant. I knew you couldn't have signed it at home because notarizing a signature means the person signs in front of you, that is the whole thing, that is the only thing, and you weren't there. I knew that, and I stamped it anyway. And then she told me why, and it was worse than a lie would have been. She said her father had told her the whole business was going under, that if the lender called the note, there would be nothing left, not the house, not her school loans, nothing, that the family would be ruined, and that this deed was a bridge, a temporary thing, a way to hold the land safe until the trouble passed, and that it was family property anyway, that it would all come out fine, that it was practically a technicality. And she had wanted so badly for that to be true that she had let it be true in her mind long enough to press her seal into the page. And then she said this sentence, "I have thought about every day since the sentence that I think will be with me when I die." She said, and I told myself you would have said yes. I looked at my granddaughter across the oak table where I had taught her to sound out the word October when she was 5 years old, moving her small finger under the letters one at a time. And I said, "Delaney, I have one question. I am only going to ask it once." She said, "Okay." I said, "Did you call me?" She opened her mouth and I did not let her fill it. I said, "I have had the same telephone number since 1994. It is written inside the front cover of every book I ever gave you in my own hand so that you would always be able to reach me." On that day before you took your seal and pressed it into that page, swearing that I had stood in front of you, did you pick up the telephone and dial the number that is written in the front of all your books and call your grandmother and ask her one single question? Did she sign this? Is this what she wants? Did you call me? She started to cry. That is not an answer, I said, and she said no. The radiator ticked. Somewhere below us in the laundromat, a dryer was going that endless soft tumble. She said, I'm so sorry. And I said, I know you are. And I meant it both times completely. She was sorry, and I knew she was sorry, and it did not change one single thing, and I told her so gently, because gentleness was the last thing I had left to give her, and I was not going to withhold it out of spite. She could have called me. The whole thing, all of it, the entire chain of ruin turned on a phone call she did not make because she did not want to hear the answer. And she knew it. And she would know it for the rest of her life. And that was a punishment I could never have designed and would never have wished on her, and it was already fully in place and there was nothing I needed to add to it. Lorraine did not come to my door. That was in character. Lorraine asked to meet me at a coffee shop on Main Street, neutral ground, a public place where nothing too raw could happen, and when I got there, she was already installed in the back corner with 2 cups on the table and a canvas tote bag on the chair beside her. My daughter-in-law is 47 years old. She has been married to my son for 28 years, and in all of that time I do not believe she and I have had a single conversation that lasted longer than 4 minutes. We were never enemies. We were something colder than enemies. We were 2 women who had decided silently and mutually and long ago that the other was not worth the effort of knowing. She did not apologize. And to be fair to her, which I am trying to be, she also did not pretend. She said, I am going to tell you some things, and then I am going to make you an offer. And she told me things. She told me the business had been insolvent since 2019, quietly, secretly propped up year after year on new debt to cover old debt. She told me the wedding had cost $160,000 and that every single dollar of it was borrowed 2 credit lines and a personal loan taken out against a car they did not even own outright. The caterer had been paid on a card with an 11-day float, meaning the money was not really there, and they were praying to cover it before the statement closed. The florist had not been paid at all. The whole thing, the gown and the band and the 200 guests on the Portland waterfront, all of it, had been a performance staged at ruinous cost for an audience of exactly 1 man, and that man was Bernard Hale. Because Bernard Hale, she said, does not do business with people who look like they need the money. And the whole wedding, the whole beautiful drowning wedding had been an advertisement, a staged demonstration of a prosperity that did not exist put on to make Bernard Hale comfortable enough to close a deal. It had worked. That was the terrible part. It had worked. And then she told me about the meal counts. She said that was me. The deposit had come due, she said, and the account was short, and it was 11 o'clock at night, and she had gone through the guest list looking for anything at all that could be trimmed. And she had found the meal counts, and she had found that a staff plate cost $42 against a guest plate of $185, and she had gone down the list and moved 4 people over. I said, why those 4? And she looked at me without cruelty, which was the worst thing about it, and she said, because you were the 4 least likely to notice. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, and it was not rage, and I have thought carefully about why. It was something much colder than rage. Because for 6 weeks I had carried that badge as an insult. I had believed it was contempt that someone in my family despised me enough to brand me staff at my own granddaughter's wedding, and there had been in a strange way a kind of comfort in that, because contempt is at least a relationship. Contempt requires that you think about a person, that you hold them in your mind long enough to look down on them. And it was not contempt. It was arithmetic. I had not been despised. I had been calculated. Someone had needed to save some money at 11 at night and had run down a list and had selected the 4 human beings whose feelings were cheapest to spend, and I was one of the 4, and there had not been a single hard feeling involved in the transaction. Not one. Because to have a hard feeling about a person, you have to first believe they are a person, and to that, spreadsheet. At 11 o'clock at night I had been a line item. That is colder than hate. I would have taken the hate. Hate would have meant I still counted. And then Lorraine made her offer. She put her hand flat on the canvas tote bag on the chair beside her, and she said she had been building a file on my son for 2 years. Emails, bank statements, minutes from 2 meetings with creditors, records of transfers between the LLC and their personal accounts. She was going to file for divorce, she said, and she needed to prove that he had been moving assets to hide them from her, and she was prepared to hand me all of it every page. And in return, she wanted two things: a written agreement that I would never bring any claim against her personally for anything, and silence about where the file had come from. She pushed the bag 6 inches toward me across the table. I looked at that bag for a long moment, and I want you to understand how badly I wanted it so that you can understand what it cost me to do what I did. I was 72 years old. I had $400 of a $2,000 retainer paid and a lawyer carrying the rest on faith, and here on a coffee shop table 6 inches from my hand was every answer I had been trying to assemble on my own, all of it gathered and organized and handed to me. It would have made everything easier. It would have made everything faster. I pushed it back. I said no. She said, "Ramona, do you understand what is in here?" I said I do, and I am not going to take it from your hand. She asked me why, and I told her the truth, which I had only fully worked out about 4 seconds before I said it. I said because I have spent my entire life receiving. My husband died and I received a check. My son needed money and I received a thank you. My granddaughter grew up and I received a Christmas card, one a year, signed by her mother. Every good thing that has ever come to me in this family came because somebody at some point decided to hand it to me, and every single one of those things could be taken back, and most of them were. And I am not going to win this the same way. If I take that bag from your hand, then I win because you gave me something, and for the rest of my life, however long it is, I will owe you, and you will know it, and I will know it, and it will sit between us the way everything has always sat between us. I would rather lose than win like that. I would honestly rather lose. Lorraine sat back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment, really looked at me the way she had not looked at me in 28 years, and she said, "Huh, just that, huh." And then I said the other thing, the thing that told her I was not being noble for the sake of nobility. I said, "But you should know that my attorney is going to subpoena you. Everything in that bag exists whether you hand it to me or not. The bank records exist at the bank. The creditor minutes exist in a file somewhere. The emails exist on a server. And documents that arrive under a court signature, compelled subpoenaed, can be put in front of a judge and believed. Documents that arrive in a tote bag in a coffee shop passed from your hand to mine in secret cannot, because the first thing their lawyer would do is ask where I got them, and the whole thing would come apart. Do not destroy anything. That is the only piece of advice I am going to give you, and it is good advice, and it is free. Do not destroy one page of what is in that bag because it is going to come to me anyway, and it is going to come to me clean." And then I paid for my own coffee to the cent and I left. Harriet served the requests the following week with Curtis Vance and Vance Coastal Holdings, LLC, named as defendants and subpoenas to the bank, to the title company that had been handling the collapsed sale, and to Lorraine Vance as a witness. And everything in that canvas tote bag came to me anyway. It came to me stamped, indexed, compelled, admissible, exactly as I had said it would, and I did not owe one single human being on this earth a thing for any of it. I had taken it rather than receiving it, and the difference between taking and receiving is the whole difference between the woman I had been for 72 years and the woman I had finally at the very end decided to become. The documents came in 3 cardboard boxes on a Tuesday, and I set them on the floor beside my table, and I worked through them the way I have always worked, slowly, in order with a pencil, and it took me 9 days. I want to tell you what was in them, because this is where the last of the truth came out, the part even I had not guessed. On the 22nd of August, 2018, a cashier's check for $290,000 drawn on the closing of my house in Rockland. The house with the lilac hedge was deposited into the operating account of Vance Coastal Holdings, LLC. And within 11 days, $261,000 of it went straight back out again in 3 payments to a site contractor in Owl's Head, a development called Tidewater Bluff. 12 lots. Roads cut in 2016, 3 foundations poured, and then nothing for years because the market had turned and the permits had gone sideways, and my son had begun a thing he did not have the money or the skill to finish. My house money, the money he had told me was an investment in Delaney's future in her fine arts degree, had gone into a hole in the ground in Owl's Head to pay a contractor for roads that led to lots nobody wanted 4 days after it left my hands. Not $1 of it had gone to a school. I called the bursar's office at the art school myself on a Thursday morning, and I did not pretend to be anyone. I said my name is Ramona Vance, and I need to know whether your institution has ever received a payment from me or in my name for any student in any year. And the young man put me on hold for 6 minutes and came back and said, "Ma'am, I have no record of any payment under that name ever." And I said, "Thank you," and I hung up, and I sat and looked at the wall for a while. Because in Lorraine's production in the second box there was a letter. 4 pages on the school's letterhead dated the 14th of April, 2018. It was a financial aid award. Full tuition. 4 years. Renewable on good academic standing. They had held that letter, my son and his wife, for 4 months before he ever came to my living room and sat down and put his hand on my knee and told me Delaney needed my house money for her tuition. She had a full scholarship. She had had it in writing for 4 months. My granddaughter never needed my house at all. They had known she never needed it. They had simply known that I would sell it, that if you told me my granddaughter's future was at stake, I would sell the roof over my own head without a second question, and they were right. And that is the part that I have had the hardest time forgiving, not that they lied, but that they knew me well enough to know exactly which lie I would fall for. They understood my love completely. They just did not return any of it. The last document was in the 3rd box in a folder marked with the name of the title company, and it was the purchase and sale agreement for the property at Spruce Head. Seller Vance Coastal Holdings, LLC. Buyer Hale Coastal Partners. Signature for the buyer, Bernard R. Hale, President. Purchase price $1,240,000. Earnest money deposit $150,000 receipted by the escrow agent on the 9th of May, 2025. I read that date and I stopped, because I knew the other date. Everyone in the family knew the other date. It was printed in the wedding program, which I still had, and it was on a framed photograph on the gift table, which I had walked past on my way out. Preston Hale had proposed to my granddaughter on the 12th of September, 2025, at sunset on the town landing at Spruce Head on the water in front of that house. It was a famous family story already 3 weeks into the marriage, the romantic proposal on the beautiful family land. The father had put down $150,000 on the land on the 9th of May. The son had gotten down on one knee on that same land on the 12th of September. The deposit came 4 months before the proposal. I sat with that page in my hands for I do not know how long, and the whole thing turned over in my mind and showed me its true shape. And its true shape was so much colder and larger than I had imagined that for a moment I could not breathe. It was not a wedding. I had gone 80 miles on a bus and paid $41 a month for a dress, and sat alone in a lobby for 2 hours and worn a badge that said vendor and staff to attend a thing I had believed was a wedding, and it was not a wedding. It was a closing. It was a real estate transaction dressed up in a gown. The land had been sold to the Hale family months before the boy ever proposed to the girl. And the marriage, my granddaughter's marriage, was part of the consideration, part of what made the deal make sense, part of what let a $1 million parcel move quietly between 2 families under the cover of a love story. The gown and the band and the 200 guests were the cost of doing business. My granddaughter was part of the price. And so in my small way at my small table in my badge, so was I. And the toast. I understood the toast at last, that terrible, tearful, generous toast. It had not been a lie told for my benefit, because I did not matter enough to lie to. I was nobody in that room. The toast had been for the room. It had been planted deliberately in the minds of 200 witnesses, so that later, when the land surfaced in Bernard Hale's name in the public record, every single person in Knox County would already have a warm and ready story about how it had come to pass. The generous family gave their land to their girl and her new husband. That was the cover story, and the toast was how they installed it 200 copies at once in the softest possible memory at the happiest possible moment, so that no one would ever think to look at the record and see that the land had never gone to the girl at all. I did not go to bed that night. I sat in the armchair by the window as I had the night of the wedding, with the documents spread across the floor around me, and around 4 in the morning, I arrived at the understanding that hurt worse than any single fact in any of the boxes. For 8 years I had believed I had been forgotten, and forgotten is a soft kind of pain. Forgotten means careless. Forgotten means busy. Forgotten means that somewhere in the noise of their lives, I had simply slipped down out of view an old woman easy to lose track of. And I could forgive that, and I had forgiven it every Sunday, sitting by a phone that did not ring for 8 years. I had not been forgotten. That was the thing. I had been carried. I had been carried on the books the entire time, a line item and asset with a low upkeep cost and a favorable disposition timeline. 6 acres of shorefront held in the name of a woman who could be counted on to die eventually, and who could, if the timing required it, be relieved of the asset a little early. Somebody had sat down with a calculator at some point and worked out what I was worth, and when I could be realized, And the answer to when was March of 2025. And the answer to what was $1,240,000. And the entire reason I still had a family at all, the entire reason for the Christmas cards, and the occasional phone call and the appearance of care, was that a person does not entirely discard an asset she has not yet realized. I had not been loved and forgotten. I had been maintained. There is a difference, and I learned it at 4 o'clock in the morning alone, on the floor of a one-room apartment surrounded by the paper proof of it, and it is the coldest thing I know. I got dressed at 6. I took the bus to South Thomaston, and I walked the last mile down the town road, because there is no stop out that far, and there never has been, and it took me 50 minutes, and I had to sit down twice on the guardrail to let my heart settle. It was a cold, clear morning, the light hard and flat off the water, and I walked down the road. My father walked down for the last time as an old man passed the ledges he knew by name, and I let myself be an old woman for that mile, tired and slow and grieving, because there was no one to see me and no reason to perform strength for the spruce trees. My father built that house over 4 summers with his brother Alvin. He shingled it in white cedar, the good stuff quarter sawn that silvers over the years to the exact color of the ledges it sits on, so that from the water the house looks like it grew there. He set the granite doorstep himself with a come-along and a plank, and a great deal of swearing, because he would not pay another man to do a thing he could do with his own hands. And the center of that step is dished and worn smooth now by 70 years of feet. My parents' feet, and my feet, and Curtis's small feet, and Delaney's smaller ones. And it was on that step I remembered walking up to it, that Delaney took her first steps exactly as Curtis had said in his toast, the one true thing in the whole performance. The door was unlocked. I stood on my father's worn step, and I put my hand on the latch, and I let myself in, and they had taken everything. My mother's pine dresser gone. The braided rug my grandmother made gone. The long table my father had built into the wall under the window so that you could sit and eat and look straight out at the water while you did it. That was gone pried off the wall, and the raw wood showed where it had been. The oil lamps we still used when the power went out. The chart of Muscle Ridge Channel that had hung by the door since before I was born, so faded you could barely read the soundings. My grandmother's blue crock, the one we kept the wooden spoons in on the counter that I could see in my mind as clearly as I could see my own hand. All of it gone. Not sold, I think. There would have been no money in most of it in old woman's furniture. Just cleared. Cleared out the way you clear a site before the machines come carried out to a dumpster or a burn pile, so that the house would be empty and clean and ready for whatever came next. 70 years of a family emptied out of a house in an afternoon by strangers with a truck on my son's instruction while the land still stood in my name. And on the wall of the front room, the wall where the chart had hung taped up flat with blue painter's tape, was a plan. I know a plan when I see one. I have read 4,000 of them across a counter, and I could read this one from the doorway. 14 lots. A 20-foot access road running straight down the middle of my father's field, the field where I learned to walk. A shared dock symbol at the town landing end. Setbacks marked in a fine hand. A note in the corner referencing a shoreland zoning application. 14 house lots on 6 acres on the water, my father saved 11 years of a lobsterman's wages to buy. The land was not going to be Delaney's home, and it had never been going to be Delaney's home. It was going to be 14 houses for 14 families of people, from away with a shared dock and a paved road where the field had been, and the cedar-shingled house my father built with his brother was going to come down because you cannot fit 14 lots around a house, and the plan showed no house. I stood there, and I did not cry. I have wondered why I did not cry, standing in the gutted shell of the one place on earth. I truly loved looking at the plan for its destruction, and I think the answer is that I had gone past the place where crying lives. I peeled the plan off the wall carefully, one corner of the blue tape at a time, so as not to tear it, because a plan is a document and a document is evidence, and I was not going to damage a piece of evidence just because looking at it was breaking my heart. I folded it into quarters along clean creases, and I put it in my bag next to the catering worksheet and the certified deed, and I walked back out through the empty house and pulled the door shut behind me and stood on my father's worn step and looked out at the water for a while, and then I walked the mile back up the road to wait for the afternoon bus. The following Monday I filed 3 complaints. All of them in one morning, all of them in my own hand, and I did not ask a lawyer to draft a single one because I did not need a lawyer for these. I had spent 30 years alongside the machinery that these complaints would feed into, And I knew the forms, and I knew the addresses, and I knew exactly how to write a thing so that a state investigator reading it on a busy Tuesday would understand in the first paragraph that it was real. The first went to the office of the Secretary of State. It was a complaint against a notary public of this state, my granddaughter, for executing a certificate of acknowledgement, stating that a person had appeared before her when that person had not, and I attached the certified copy of the deed and the certificate of jury service side by side, so that anyone reading it could see in 10 seconds that the notary had sworn a woman stood before her who was at that hour provably sitting in a jury pool 20 miles away under the supervision of the same court system. I also, and I will be honest, that this was the hardest single moment of the whole affair, had a copy of her notary journal, which had come to me in the third box subpoenaed from the LLC's files. Because a notary is required by law to keep a journal and entry for every act she performs. And under the 14th of March 2025, in my granddaughter's own handwriting, the hand I taught there is a line that reads, R. Vance. Quitclaim deed, and in the column for how the signer was identified, it says personally known to notary. Personally known to notary. She wrote that. It is not a wrong box checked in haste. It is a sentence written in her own hand about a woman she knew perfectly well was not in the room, and I recognized the handwriting because I had guided it across a page while it sounded out the word October, and now here it was grown up and swearing a lie to the state of Maine in a bound journal. The second complaint went to the Maine Real Estate Commission, and it was about my son. A licensed broker of this state had prepared and recorded an instrument transferring real property on a signature obtained by misrepresentation, and had filed a transfer tax declaration claiming an exemption he was not entitled to, and I laid it out plainly with the documents attached. The Real Estate Commission does not care about your feelings, and it does not care about your family. It cares about whether a person holding a license from the state of Maine used that license and that expertise to commit fraud, and the answer on the documents was yes. The third complaint went to Adult Protective Services, and it was a report of suspected financial exploitation of a person over the age of 60 by a family member, and the person I was reporting was myself. That one took me the longest to write by far. I sat with the form for 2 hours. There is a box on it for the relationship of the reporter to the alleged victim, and I sat with my pen hovering over that box for a long time, and in the end, I wrote self. And under the heading for the alleged perpetrator, I sat even longer, and in the end, I wrote son. Self and son. 2 words, 1 on each line, and I have never in my life written 2 words that cost me more. I walked to the post office on Lime Rock Street, and I mailed all 3, and then I bought a book of stamps I did not need because my hands wanted something to do with themselves, and buying stamps was the only ordinary thing available. I saw Delaney once more before the trial, and I asked her to come. I had something to tell her that I had not told my lawyer, and did not intend to tell my lawyer because it was not about the case. She came again on the bus, and she sat at my table, and I told her plainly. I said the complaint I filed about your seal went to the Secretary of State. That is a licensing matter. It is administrative. They will take your commission, your notary commission, and you will not be able to notarize anything again, and that will follow you. But I did not give your name to the district attorney's office. I could have. What you did is a crime, and it would have made my civil case stronger to have a criminal referral running alongside it, and I chose not to. I want you to understand that I chose not to. She said, why? And I said I want to be very clear with you, because you are going to be asked to speak at a hearing, and I do not want one single word of what you say to be about a bargain. I am not doing this to buy anything from you. I do not want you to say one syllable in that courtroom that you do not want to say of your own free will. Do you understand me? I am not trading you your freedom for your testimony. I am giving it to you free with nothing attached, and then you will do whatever you are going to do, and it will be yours. She said, then why? And I said, because you were 6 years old at that oak table, and you painted me a purple horse and told me it was me, and I still have it framed in a drawer and I look at it sometimes. That is why. You are going to lose your seal, but you are not going to lose your freedom, because I decided that a long time before this ever happened, back when you were 6. And it is not the kind of decision I am willing to unmake now, just because you hurt me. That is the last thing I have left that I am able to give you. And after this, there is nothing else. Do you understand that too? This is the last gift. There will not be another one. She nodded. She did not argue. And she did not thank me either. And I was glad, so glad, because I do not think I could have borne it if she had thanked me. And I think she knew that. And I think her not thanking me was the last kind thing that passed between us. Harriet called me that Friday. She said the court had set the matter down for a hearing in the second week of October before Justice Alton Prewitt. And then she said, and I want you to hear this part very carefully, because you are the only client I have ever had who is actually going to enjoy it. Under that statute, the Improvident Transfers Act, we do not have to prove that he took it. He has to prove that he did not. I said, say that again. And she said it again. He has to prove that he did not. I sat down on the edge of my narrow bed with the phone against my ear, and I looked at the folded plan for 14 lots sitting on my table, and I thought about the counter. 30 years I had stood at that counter in that building and handed other people the record and watched what it did to them, watched their faces when the paper turned out to be true. 30 years of being the one who reads it out and hands it over and cannot fix it, only report it. And now for the first time in my life, the record was mine, and the burden was on the other side, and the whole enormous, merciless machinery of the public record that I had served for 30 years was finally at the very end going to serve me. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in the second week of October in the Superior Court on Union Street, in the same brick building that holds the Registry of Deeds. I had walked past that courtroom 4 times a day for 12 years on my way to and from my back office, and I had never once gone in. It is a strange thing to spend a career inside a building and never enter its most important room, and I thought about that walking up the granite steps that morning, that for 30 years I had worked in the basement of the law in the record room, in the place where the results of the courtroom get filed and preserved, and only now at 72 was I going up the stairs into the room where the law is actually made to happen. I wore the pale blue dress. It took me 1 hour and 10 minutes to do the 11 buttons that morning, longer than at the wedding, because my hands are always worse in the cold. And it was a cold October morning, and I used the crochet hook, and I did not hurry, because I have learned that there is a dignity in doing a hard thing slowly and well, rather than fast and badly. And I was going to walk into that courtroom having done everything slowly and well. In my purse I carried the laminated badge on its black cord. I had not taken it out of that purse since the night of the wedding, and I do not fully know why I brought it to court, except that it had begun the whole thing, and it felt right that it should be in the room when the thing ended. Verna Tarbox came. She is 81 years old, and she got a ride from a neighbor, and she came into that courtroom, pushing her folding walker with Marjorie Ames and Pauline Hutchins behind her, and the 3 of them sat down in the second row on my side of the aisle. I had not asked them to come. I had not even told them the date. Verna leaned over the rail before the session started, her cataract eyes searching for my face, and she said, "We read about it in the paper." And I said, "I am glad you came." And she said, "Well, we are on the list." And I understood what she meant, and I nearly lost my composure right there before anything had even started, because the 4 of us had been moved to the staff counts together, the 4 least likely to notice, and 3 of the 4 had noticed after all, and had gotten themselves out of bed and into a car and down to a courthouse to sit behind me, because we were on the list, the real list, the list of who belongs to whom, the one that does not have a price per plate. Justice Alton Prewitt is a lean, unhurried man of 60 with a flat way of speaking that gives you absolutely nothing, and I decided I liked him within the first 10 minutes because a judge who gives you nothing is a judge who cannot be worked, and I had spent enough time around courtrooms as a records witness to know that the ones who cannot be worked are the ones the honest party wants. Harriet called me first. This surprised the other side. I could see it surprised them, because you do not usually lead with your own plaintiff, you build up to her. But Harriet did it on purpose, and she had explained her reasoning to me beforehand. She said they are going to spend this whole trial trying to tell the judge who you are. A frail, confused old woman, or a bitter, vengeful one. They have not decided which yet, but it will be one of those 2. I want the judge to meet the real you before their lawyer gets to describe you. I want you to be a fact in his mind before they can make you a theory. I was in that witness box for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and I did not cry once, and I want to explain why, because it is the same reason the whole thing worked. I was not there to tell them what had happened to me. Anybody can tell a story about what happened to them, and a story is only ever as strong as the person listening is willing to let it be, and a good defense attorney's entire job is to be unwilling. I was not there to be believed. I was there to read the record, and reading the record is a completely different act because the record does not ask to be believed. It simply is. I began in 1958. I gave them the book and page of my father's purchase, and I read the property description aloud, the whole thing beginning at an iron pin set in the westerly side of the town road and running by the courses and distances. My father bought it under because that description had not changed in 67 years, and it was the identical description that appeared on the quitclaim deed my son recorded. I gave them the mortgage of 1974 and its discharge in 1979. I gave them the 2 estate deeds of 1996 and the probate docket numbers that stood behind them. I gave them the 29 years of nothing, and I explained to the court, because Harriet asked me to, what 29 years of nothing means in a chain of title, that it is not emptiness, but the opposite of emptiness, that it is the fingerprint of a family holding on. And then I gave them Book 4471, page 202. I explained what a transfer tax declaration is in plain words to a courtroom, the way I had explained it to 1,000 nervous clients. And then I read them the one that had been filed with that deed, the one stating a nominal consideration, and I told the court that in 30 years of examining title, I had learned to treat a nominal transfer of waterfront property into a limited liability company as the single loudest signal there is in the record, a klaxon, a thing that stops an examiner cold, and that this one had been sitting in a public building on that very street, available to anyone in the world who cared to ask for 16 months. Then Harriet put up the 4 bank signature cards blown up large and mounted side by side on an easel, and I stood at that easel with a pointer and explained my own 2 hands to a courtroom full of strangers. I showed them the 1991 signature, young and firm. I showed them where the capital R begins to lose its height in the 2022 card. I showed them the current card where the loop in the middle initial simply is not there because the joint will not carry the pen through the turn any longer without lifting. And then I turned the pointer to the signature on the deed, tall R whole unbroken loop, and I said, that is my hand. I have never once denied that it is my hand. But it is not my hand at 71. It is my hand at 64, 3 days after my husband's funeral. The disease in my fingers is my witness, and it testifies that I could not have made that signature on the day the notary swore I made it, because on that day my hand was no longer able to make it. Their lawyer objected that I was not a handwriting expert, and Justice Prewitt said in his flat voice that the witness was not offering an opinion on whose hand had made the mark, since she had conceded it was her own, but was testifying to the condition of her own body over time, about which she was the only living expert, and that he would allow it. And I thought, that is the judge who cannot be worked, and I felt the ground go solid under me. On cross-examination, their lawyer, who was not a bad man, only a man doing his job for a bad client, asked me whether I loved my son, and I said yes. He asked whether I had ever in the years since my husband died asked Curtis for help with a form of bill, a ride, an appointment, and I said yes many times. And he asked in the gentle closing way they do whether it was possible that in the course of all that helping I might simply have forgotten signing one document among many on one hard day years ago. And I said it is not only possible, it is exactly what happened. That is the entire case. I signed a page, and I did not know what it was because my son told me it was something else on the worst morning of my life, and I trusted him. I have never once said otherwise. And he sat down after that a good deal faster than he had stood up, because there is nothing left to cross-examine in a witness who agrees with your premise and shows you the trap underneath it. And then it was their turn. And this is the part I most want you to understand, because it is the whole reason a woman of 72 with $400 paid on a retainer was not crushed flat in that room by a family with money and lawyers. The burden was not on me. Their lawyer did not have to poke holes in my story. He had to prove 4 things affirmatively, all 4, and he had to prove every one of them out of a record that his own client had created. He had to prove that adequate consideration had been paid. And there was none because the declaration his own client filed said nominal in his client's own hand. He had to prove that there was no confidential or fiduciary relationship between my son and me. And I sat there and watched him fail, because Harriet put up one after another, the signature card adding Curtis to my checking account in 2018, and the hardship abatement application in my son's own handwriting, and the insurance policy, directing all my correspondence to his office, so that for 8 years every notice about my own house went to my son's desk, and never once to mine. A confidential relationship is a thing you prove with exactly those documents, and my son had signed every one of them himself, believing he was signing proof of his kindness. He had to prove that I was not a dependent elderly person, and he tried that one hardest, and it was the one stretch of the whole day where I felt the ground shift because I do not look dependent, and I do not sound dependent, and I was not going to pretend to be. And Harriet had warned me that this was the danger. And what sank him was not me. It was the abatement application. Because a hardship abatement is granted only on a finding that the taxpayer genuinely cannot pay her own taxes. and my son had told the town of South Thomaston in writing over his own signature that his mother could not pay the taxes on her own land. He had filed the sworn proof of my financial dependence himself years earlier to save me a few $100s a year, and now his own lawyer could not stand up and argue the opposite. The document would not let him, and he had to prove that I had received independent legal advice before signing away my land. And there was none. There was no attorney. There was no closing. There was no letter, no bill, no file, no record anywhere of any lawyer advising me about anything. There was a table in Rockland 3 days after a funeral in a folder under my son's arm, and his finger at the bottom of a page, and the words, "Right here, Mom." 4 elements, 4 documents. And not one of the 4 documents was mine, and not one of them could be taken back or explained away, because my son had written every single one of them down himself in his own hand, over his own signature thinking each time that he was building the record of a devoted son caring for his failing mother. They called Delaney in the afternoon. She had her own lawyer by then, a young man from Portland, and when her name was called, he stood up before she had even reached the box and told the court that he had advised his client of her rights, and that she would be declining to answer any questions that might tend to incriminate her. That is her right. It is everyone's right, and I would not have taken it from her for anything in the world. And I want that understood, because what happened next was her doing, and not mine. She stood up anyway. She walked to the witness box past her own lawyer without looking at him, and she was sworn, her raised hand visibly shaking, and she took the oath in a steady voice. Harriet asked her 4 questions. Are you a notary public commissioned by the state of Maine? Yes. Is the seal on this exhibit your seal? Yes. Is this entry in this journal dated the 14th of March 2025, reading R. Vance quitclaim deed personally known to notary in your handwriting? Yes. And then did Ramona Vance personally appear before you on the 14th of March 2025? Her lawyer was on his feet. Justice Prewitt looked at her over his half-glasses and said, Miss Hale, you do not have to answer that question, and you should listen to your counsel. She looked down at her own hands in the witness box for what felt like a very long time. Across the room at the defense table, her father was watching her, and I could feel him watching her, feel the pressure of it coming off him like heat. And I was not watching her. I want to be honest about that because it is the thing I am most at peace with in this whole affair. I had decided before I came into that courtroom that I would not look at my granddaughter while she made that decision, whatever it was, because whatever she did, I wanted it to be entirely hers, unpressured by the sight of my face. I have spent my whole life being a face that other people check a face they glance at to see whether they have permission, and I was not going to be that for her now, not in the one moment of her life that was going to belong to her completely. So I sat with my hands folded in my lap, and I looked straight ahead at the state seal on the wall behind the bench, and I let her be alone with it. She said no. 1 word. She was crying by the time she got it out, but she said it clearly so that there could be no mistaking it, no asking her to repeat it. No, Ramona Vance had not appeared before her. The certification was false. Her father made a sound at the defense table that I had never heard him make in 49 years. A short broken sound, and Justice Prewitt asked Miss Hale if she wished to take a recess, and she said no thank you in the same clear voice, and she stepped down from the box and she walked past the counsel tables and out of that courtroom, and I have not been in a room with her since. Then Bernard Hale's attorney stood up, because Hale Coastal Partners had intervened in the case to try to protect its $150,000 deposit, and he made the argument I had been waiting 4 months to hear him make. His client, he said, was a bona fide purchaser for value. They had negotiated at arm's length, ordered a title search, obtained a commitment for title insurance, and paid $150,000 into escrow with no knowledge whatsoever of any defect. An innocent buyer, he said, who should not be punished for a seller's fraud. And I had known this argument was coming since the night I sat at my table and looked at the 2 ages of paper, and it is the entire reason the difference between void and voidable had mattered from the very first hour. Because if this had been fraud in the inducement, if I had known I was signing a deed and merely been lied to about the terms, then the deed would be voidable, and a bona fide purchaser would be protected, and Bernard Hale would keep my father's land, and I would spend the rest of my life suing my son for money that no longer existed. That is the lane in which I lose. But it was not that lane. It was fraud in the factum. My son had lied to me about the very nature of the document, told me a deed was the 2nd page of a utility transfer, so that I never knew I was conveying anything at all. And a deed obtained by fraud in the factum is void from its inception, An a void deed conveys nothing to anyone, and a person cannot, in good faith or bad, buy a thing from someone who never owned it, because there was never anything there to buy. Harriet made that argument in 11 minutes cleanly, and I watched the intervener's lawyer understand about 4 minutes in that he was going to lose. And then Harriet made the second argument, the one I liked even better because it was simpler and it belonged to my whole life's work. She held up the transfer tax declaration, and she pointed out that it was a public document filed with the deed indexed in the very same registry that the buyer's own abstractor had visited twice in the weeks before the closing, and that it stated on its face plainly that 6 acres of Maine waterfront had changed hands for nominal consideration. And she said a buyer who pays $1,240,000 for a parcel that changed hands 16 months earlier for nothing at all has been put on notice by the record, whether he troubled to read it or not. And the entire reason this state maintains a registry of deeds open to all is so that no one may ever stand up afterward and say he did not know. The record was there. It was always there. Their own abstractor had walked past it twice. Innocence was not available to a buyer who had been handed the means to know and had chosen not to look. Justice Prewitt issued his decision 3 weeks later in writing 11 pages. He found that the instrument recorded at Book 4471, page 202, had been procured by fraud in the factum that no valid delivery of a deed had ever occurred, and that the instrument was therefore void and of no effect from its inception. He found in the alternative that even had it not been void, the transfer was an improvident transfer within the meaning of the statute, that the defendant had failed to rebut the presumption of undue influence on all 4 elements, and that it would be set aside on that ground as well. He ordered the deed discharged from the record and title confirmed in Ramona L. Vance. He ordered the defendant to pay my costs and my attorney's fees. He denied the intervener's claim. And he wrote one sentence about that denial that I have read more times than I will admit to anyone, which was that the record was open to all who cared to look. Open to all who cared to look. 30 years I had spent keeping that record open, and at the end of my life it kept me. Harriet read me the last page over the telephone, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I have been doing this for 19 years. Mrs. Vance and I have never once had a client build the case herself." And I said I did not build the case. I only read it. It was there the whole time. I only read it. Here is what happened to the rest of them, and I want to be careful with this part, because none of it came from me, and it matters to me that you understand that none of it came from me. I filed 3 complaints on one Monday morning, and then the state did what the state does on its own schedule, without asking my permission, and without needing it. The Maine Real Estate Commission held its hearing in January, and my son surrendered his broker's license before they could suspend it, which changes nothing except the wording of the entry. It is on the public licensing lookup now. Anybody in this state can type his name into a box and read it in about 9 seconds, which is, I have noted, roughly the length of time it took him to slide a page across a table in front of me 3 days after his father's funeral. The Secretary of State revoked Delaney's notary commission in November. Vance Coastal Holdings filed for bankruptcy that same month, and Tidewater Bluff, the 12 empty lots and the 3 foundations going green in the weeds, went to the creditor. Lorraine filed for divorce 8 days after the decision came down, with 2 years of documents that had come out of a court subpoena stamped inadmissible, and I have wondered ever since whether she knew all along sitting in that coffee shop that the subpoenaed version was the only version of that file that would ever be worth anything, and that I would tell her so, and that she had come to me not to give me the file, but to be told to keep it. I will never know. She is not a woman who tells you her reasons. And as for the district attorney, I do not know what he will do, and I never gave that office a name. But a notarial complaint gets referred. A bankruptcy trustee reads the transfers. A public decision is a public document. I have no control over any of it, and I have stopped pretending that I ever did. I made the one choice that was actually mine to make, which was not to give my granddaughter's name to a prosecutor, and everything else the state will decide on its own, and I have made my peace with not being the one who decides. There is one more thing I found in the bank production back in September, and I sat with it a long while. My gift envelope from the wedding, the one with the $400 check in it that had taken me 7 months to set aside $40 and $50 at a time. It cleared the following Monday into the wedding account, which was overdrawn by $906, and it went straight back out again to the florist. My $400 saved over 7 months paid a piece of the flower bill for the wedding at which I was seated with the staff. And I have thought about that check more than I have thought about the $1,240,000, and I have wondered why. And I think it is because it was the only part of the whole business that I gave freely. Everything else they took, that I gave, and they spent it on flowers. There is something in that I have not finished understanding, and I do not think I am meant to. Curtis came out to Spruce Head in March a year to the month after he recorded the deed. I was on the porch. He got out of a car that was not his car, an older car, a car a man drives after the good car is gone, and he stood at the bottom of my father's granite step, and he did not come up it, and he did not apologize, and I did not expect him to, and I have decided that I do not need him to. He asked me what I was going to do with 6 acres. I went inside and I got a folded paper off the long table, the new table, and I came back out and I put it in his hand. He thought for a moment that it was a deed back to him. I watched him think it. I watched a flicker of hope cross his face, the first honest thing I had seen there in years, the hope that his mother at the very end would do what mothers do, and forgive and hand it back, and let the whole thing dissolve into the family it had come out of. It was a warranty deed conveying the entire parcel, all 6 acres, and the house my father built to a non-profit organization called the Mid-Coast Elder Title Project, which provides free title review and property counseling to people over the age of 65 in Knox, Waldo, and Lincoln counties, so that what happened to me happens to fewer of them. I drafted that deed myself. A person is permitted in this state to prepare a deed conveying her own land, and I checked that I was allowed to, and then I checked it again because that is who I am, and then I drafted it cleanly with a proper description, running back to my father's iron pen. And in the 4th paragraph of that deed I reserved to myself a life estate in the dwelling and in the land, which means that I live here in my father's house until I die, and then it passes to the project entirely and forever, and no one named Vance will ever own it again, including me. He read it twice, and he said you gave it away, and I said I placed it where nobody named Vance will ever own it again. And that includes me, Curtis, and it includes you, and that is the entire point. He said that was supposed to come to us, and I said, Curtis, it was going to come to you. It was in my will for 30 years. All you ever had to do was wait and be decent to me, and it would have been yours cleanly with love, and none of this would ever have happened. You did not want it later. That is the whole of it. You wanted it later, and you got impatient, and you wanted it now, and you wanted it enough to hand your own daughter a page you knew was a lie, and let her press her seal into it. You could not wait for a dying woman to die, and now no one will ever have it, and that is the price, and I set the price myself, and I would set it again. He stood there a while at the bottom of my father's step, and then he got back into the car that was not his car, and he drove away, and that is the last time I saw my son. I moved out here in April. The apartment on Park Street is gone, and I do not miss it, not the radiator, and not the brick wall, and not one single thing about it. I brought the geranium off the windowsill, and it is doing better out here in this light, in a real window that looks at the water. The furniture is not my mother's, because my mother's furniture is gone and is not coming back, so it is somebody else's furniture from an estate sale over in Thomaston. An old woman's things bought cheap, and I have made my peace with that too, because it turns out you can love a house without loving the particular objects in it, and the house is my father's, and that is enough. The purple horse hangs in the front room, framed on the wall where the plan for 14 lots was taped up with blue tape. I put it there on purpose. I want it to be the thing on that wall. 3 mornings a week. I take the bus into Rockland, and I sit at a folding table in a borrowed room at the Elder Title Project with a laptop and a legal pad, and old people come in carrying a shoebox or a manila envelope, or sometimes nothing at all, and they sit down across from me, and they say some version of it every time I think something happened to my house. And I pull the chain. I show them what the record says. And most of the time, nothing is wrong, and they have come in frightened over an assessment card they could not read or a form they did not understand, and I get to tell them. So get to watch the fear go out of their faces, and that is the best part of my week, better than the winds telling a frightened old man that his house is fine, that it says right here that it is fine that he can go home and stop lying awake. In the first 4 months, I found 2 that were real. 2 out of all of them. One was a woman in Warren, 83 years old, and a nephew in a quitclaim deed, and when I told her what it said, she put her hand flat on the table, the exact way I had put my hand flat on the table in my apartment on a Sunday afternoon a year before, and I recognized the gesture, and I reached across and I said, I know. Sit down. We are going to start in the year your husband bought it. And we did. Verna comes out on Sundays when somebody can drive her. Marjorie and Pauline came in July, and we ate at the long table under the window, the new long table looking out at the water, the The 4 of us who were moved to the staff count together, 3 of whom noticed, all of whom are still and will always be on the list. I still have the badge. I did not throw it away, and I am not going to. It is in the drawer of the table by the door, and every so often I take it out, and I look at it, and I have decided that it is the only thing anybody in that family ever gave me that told me the exact truth. They printed what they thought I was, and they hung it around my neck, and they let me carry it into a room with 200 people in it. And the funny thing, the thing I could not have explained to a single soul at that reception, is that they were very nearly right. There was only a word missing off the top of that badge. It was not guest. It was not grandmother of the bride. The missing word was owner. I have been the owner of this land since 1996. I was the owner of it the whole night I sat at table 19 in my plastic badge. I was the owner of it every single day for 16 months, while a piece of paper in a public building said otherwise. And I am the owner of it now, sitting on my father's granite step in the evening with the water going gray, the way it does out here, and the spruce black against it, and no 14 lots, and no road through the field, and no shared dock, only the house my father built with his brother over 4 summers, and the field, and the water, and me. They were never going to give it back to me. That is the part I want you to take with you, if you take anything at all from an old woman's story. They were never going to give it back. Nobody was ever going to hand it to me across a counter the way everything in my life had been handed to me, to be taken away again whenever it suited them. That is not how it ended. I want to be very clear about how it ended, because it is the truest sentence I know, and I have earned the right to say it plainly. I went and got it.